Alright, what's going on, y'all? Lost the first intro. I can't bring myself to do the whole thing again. We're doing both chapters at the same time. Contingency Guillotine and Deterministic Moral Forces. Check the description for everything we cover, and I hope you enjoy.
In relation to the rest of reality, the specialness of humanity is not that we alone possess mind, but that our mind is a brilliant point on the spectrum, capable of understanding the very spectrum that produced it. That self-understanding in the persistent present is both our logical inheritance and our existential responsibility. The Contingency Guillotine. I hereby sentence objective morality to death for the crime of causing confusion and building cruel societies. No morality can be truly objective if it requires an interpreter, for all interpretation is contingent on a mind. Thus, all moral systems, including divine ones, are necessarily subjective. If a rock rolls into a rock and cracks it, that action is absent of all morality and judgment, whereas a rock with a mind that intends to hit and crack another rock with a mind necessarily includes the interpretation of those minds, and morality clearly rears its head. The illusion of objective morality. It is a comforting illusion that moral truths exist out there in the universe, eternal principles that stand independent of any mind. Many cultures and philosophies cling to the idea of objective morality, believing that what is right or wrong has an absolute existence beyond human opinion. We speak of human rights as if they were cosmic laws, or of good and evil as if they were natural properties like gravity. This chapter begins by shattering that illusion. In reality, all morality is inextricably tied to minds and cannot transcend the subjective frameworks that conscious beings create. If every thinking being were to vanish, concepts of good and evil would vanish with them. That simple fact reveals a profound truth. Morality does not exist independently of us. It lives and dies in the realm of consciousness. At its core, morality is about valuation, judgments of what is good or bad, what ought to be done versus what shouldn't. And valuation requires a valuer. A world with no conscious beings contains no preferences, no purposes, and no values. It has facts, like mountains and stars and chemical reactions, but no morals. A universe devoid of minds would have no one to care if an action is right or wrong. This stark observation forms the heart of the contingency guillotine. Any moral claim, no matter how universal it sounds, must be processed and understood by a mind. No morality can stand apart from a consciousness to interpret it. The very moment we articulate a moral truth, we are performing an act of interpretation with our minds, assigning meaning and oughtness to a situation. Thus, morality is necessarily mind-dependent. The belief in an objective moral law floating out there in the ether is a myth. Like a phantom, it disappears upon close logical inspection. No morality without minds. The contingency guillotine. The contingency guillotine is the decisive cut that separates imagined objective morality from reality. It states plainly, if a moral truth requires any mind to recognize or apply it, then it cannot be truly objective. Objective truths, by definition, would hold true without any interpreter. For example, the statement 2 + 2 = 4 is a logical truth that does not need a human mind to make it true. Even if no one were around to do the math, combining 2 and 2 objects would still yield 4 objects. By contrast, consider a moral statement like killing is wrong. Is that true in the absence of any mind to conceive it? Without a mind, the concept of wrong has no meaning at all. The moral statement needs a thinker to evaluate a killing and label it wrong. Unlike a mathematical fact or a physical law, a moral principle has no reality of its own apart from the valuations of conscious beings. Interpretation is the lifeblood of morality, and interpretation only happens in minds. The contingency guillotine cleanly severs morality from any claim of objectivity, just as a physical guillotine would sever the head, the mind, from the body of morality. Without the mind attached, moral truths bleed out. They cannot survive as objective, independent entities. Think of a legal system to illustrate this dependence. We can inscribe laws in stone or print them in law books, but those laws are nothing but idle marks and symbols unless there are living beings to read, interpret, and enforce them. A law against theft has no effect or meaning if no one is there to uphold it. In the same way, a moral rule like be kind is powerless and void in a world without agents to be kind or to value kindness. Morality requires enforcers and adherents. Even a perfectly reasoned moral code would sit impotent without someone to act on it. All morality needs a mind to give it meaning and force. Another analogy is language. A dictionary full of words and definitions objectively exists as ink on paper, but without speakers to understand and use those words, the dictionary is a lifeless artifact. Language isn't objectively meaningful on its own. Its meaning exists only in the interaction with minds. The same is true of ethics. We can imagine the most perfect moral principles, but unless a mind grasps them and a will carries them out, they might as well not exist. This truth holds even if we extend beyond humans. Some might argue that a superintelligent AI or some idealized rational machine could enforce objective morality without human bias. But any AI would still require initial programming, a set of rules or goals given to it by designers, which means human minds would have planted the seeds of its morality. The AI would then be interpreting those rules as it operates. It might do so more consistently or efficiently than a person, but it's still not a mind-independent morality. It's following instructions contingent on its creators. In short, no clever workaround escapes the need for a mind. If morality is being applied or evaluated at all, some cognitive framework is at play. The contingency guillotine leaves no exception. Any moral system reliant on an interpreter cannot be objective in the mind-independent sense. Whether the interpreter is a human jurist, an AI, or even a deity, as we'll see, the necessity of interpretation means the moral truth is contingent, not absolute. Failed quests for objective morality. Over the centuries, philosophers and theologians have proposed various foundations for an objective moral order. These attempts all share one goal: to locate morality in something that does not depend on any individual's whims or cultural quirks. Perhaps, they argue, morality comes from pure reason, or from the decrees of a god, or from nature itself. Each of these proposals, however, ultimately fails to escape the guillotine's blade. No matter how lofty the source, if a moral law is to have any effect, a mind must still decide what it means and that it ought to be obeyed. Let's examine some of the most notable of these attempted escapes and why they falter. Rationalist ethics. Kantian duty. Immanuel Kant famously tried to derive an objective morality from reason alone. His categorical imperative instructs that we should act only according to maxims we could will as universal laws. This sounds like morality built on pure logic, independent of particular human preferences. However, even Kant's framework cannot fly free of contingency. Rationality itself lives in minds. There is no abstract reason floating outside of thinkers. Moreover, rational people can and do reach different conclusions about moral duties. If pure reason truly yielded objective moral laws, all rational beings would logically arrive at the same set of moral rules, just as all mathematicians can agree on a proof. They don't. Kant's universal laws still require a rational agent to interpret a situation and apply the rule, and different minds may interpret the same rule differently. In the end, Kantian ethics smuggles in a hidden contingency. It assumes that reason has intrinsic moral authority. But why should reason alone demand moral respect? That premise itself isn't a product of reason, it's a value judgment by Kant, a mind, about reason's importance. Thus, Kantian ethics, for all its rigour, cannot provide a mind-independent morality. Its edicts are only meaningful within the context of reasoning beings, and even then they are subject to those beings' perspectives. Divine command, morality from God. Another classic claim is that morality is objective because it comes from a supreme being. Right is what God ordains, wrong is what God forbids. On the surface, this seems to anchor morality in something ultimate and external to humans. Yet divine command theory encounters the same fundamental contingency problem. First, if one says that God simply interprets a moral law that exists beyond him, then even God is playing the role of interpreter, and we have to ask who set up that higher law.
That's right, Bubba. You got the right sound there, Bubba. Can this thing work?
First, if one says that God simply interprets a moral law that exists beyond him, then even God is playing the role of interpreter, and we have to ask who set up that higher law. If, on the other hand, God creates moral law by divine decree, then morality is contingent on God's will. It could have been otherwise had God willed differently, so it's not an absolute constant, but rather a chosen standard, chosen by a divine mind no less. Furthermore, humans who follow divine moral codes are still interpreting God's will. Holy books and commandments do not speak for themselves. Believers must read them, consider context, resolve ambiguities, and sometimes even debate what God really meant. If a moral law were truly objective in the strong sense, everyone would grasp it in the same way without need for interpretation or endless commentary. Instead, religious moral teachings have spawned thousands of sects and conflicting doctrines, all evidence that even supposedly God-given morality is far from clear-cut or universally self-evident. The fact that people kill and conflict over God's absolute moral word shows just how subjective their understanding of that word is. Divine morality, then, either reduces to God's subjective morality, the universe according to him, or to an inscrutable higher law that not even believers can agree upon without mental interpretation. In both cases, it fails to be human independent and unequivocal. Nature and biology, moral naturalism. Could morality be objective in the sense of being derived from nature or evolution? Some philosophers and scientists argue that because certain behaviors promote survival and well-being, morality is basically an extension of natural laws, or biological imperatives. For example, they might claim that human beings have evolved compassion and cooperation because those traits helped our ancestors thrive, therefore morality is grounded in our biology. It's certainly true that our evolutionary history influences our sense of right and wrong, but influence is not the same as objective justification. Nature produces all sorts of behaviors: competition, violence, altruism, and everything in between. Saying morality is what's natural just begs the question, whose nature? Which natural drives? We inevitably cherry-pick aspects of nature that align with the kind of morality we prefer. One person will say helping others is morally good because empathy is in our genes, while another might justify aggression or dominance because survival of the fittest is a natural principle. Both are interpretations of nature's facts through a value-laden lens. Nature itself is amoral, it simply is. We humans project our values onto it. Even if science explains why we have moral feelings in terms of neuroscience or evolution, that doesn't make those feelings objectively binding rules. We still choose to embrace or reject what nature gave us. Thus, attempts to derive an ought from what is in nature inevitably sneak in a human perspective. This is exactly what the philosopher David Hume pointed out with the is-ought problem. You cannot logically derive a moral ought from a factual is without inserting a presupposed value. No description of the world, no matter how complete, yields a moral conclusion without a mind deciding that one state is preferable to another. The naturalistic approach fails because it treats human desired outcomes like well-being or survival as if they were universal imperatives. They are not. They are important to us, to sentient creatures who happen to value living and flourishing. In short, nature provides facts and consequences, but moral relevance is something we humans assign to those facts. Well-being, as an objective value, modern moral realism, a contemporary variant of moral naturalism, comes from thinkers who claim we can objectively measure morality by some universal value like well-being. For instance, neuroscientist Sam Harris has argued that morality is really about the maximization of the well-being of conscious creatures. And since science can, in principle, measure factors that influence well-being, like happiness, suffering, health, etc., moral questions have objective factual answers. At first blush, this sounds promising. Who doesn't want well-being? But here again, a crucial assumption hides in plain sight that well-being ought to be the ultimate value. Harris essentially handpicks well-being as the good. But why should we treat that as an objective given rather than a deeply ingrained preference? One could agree completely that suffering is undesirable, as nearly all of us do, and still point out that this is grounded in our shared subjective experience of pain, not a standalone cosmic decree. We can measure suffering with brain scans or psychological surveys, but no MRI machine will ever spit out a readout that says this is objectively morally wrong, without us already agreeing that suffering matters. It's like measuring the weather. We can objectively say a storm has high wind speeds and low pressure, but calling it a bad storm depends on human concerns. Bad for whom? Relative to what? Likewise, a world full of misery is bad because conscious beings hate misery, not because of an independent moral meter. So even the most science-friendly moral realism sneaks in a value choice, and thereby remains contingent on minds that choose that value. As laudable as the goal of maximizing well-being is, it isn't an objective moral truth handed down from the heavens. It's a moral framework we adopt because it resonates with our empathetic nature and rational analysis of consequences. We should be clear that we are the ones choosing to elevate well-being as the cardinal value. Doing so is a subjective commitment widely shared, but not a proof of objective morality. In each of these cases, reason, God, nature, or well-being, we see the pattern. An attempt is made to anchor morality in something purportedly bigger than any one individual. But every attempt ends up relying on interpretation and assumptions by conscious minds. Kant had to assume reason's supremacy and interpret what duty requires. Theologians have to interpret divine commands and assume God's goodness. Naturalists have to decide which natural tendencies count as moral. Utilitarians have to define and prioritize, well, being. There is no escaping the circle. We are always in the loop. The moment a person says this is an objective moral truth, they must also explain why it is moral and why it is true. And that explanation is their mind at work, framing and justifying a value. The very act of defending a moral claim reveals its contingency. If a moral truth were truly objective, it would need no defense or interpretation. It would shine with self-evidence, unquestioned, and identical in every observer's eyes. Clearly, that's not what we encounter in ethics. We encounter debate, diversity of opinion, culturally dependent norms, and evolving attitudes. These are telltale signs that we are dealing not with fixed stars of morality, but with fires lit and tended by us fallible humans. The myth of moral absolutes. Belief in objective morality often goes hand in hand with belief in moral absolutes, principles that hold everywhere, for everyone, at all times. Yet history and anthropology provide a sobering counterpoint. What people consider absolute moral truth has changed dramatically from era to era and culture to culture. If morality were truly an objective feature of reality, we would expect it to be constant and universally recognized, much as the boiling point of water or the charge of an electron is the same everywhere. Instead, our species' record is one of moral fluidity. This doesn't mean morality is arbitrary or random. Often there are good reasons for changes, but it does mean moral values are woven from context, not carved from eternal stone. Consider slavery. Today, we view owning another human being as one of the greatest moral wrongs, a violation of fundamental human rights. This stance, we like to think, is obviously true. But for millennia, slavery was not only tolerated, but even deemed morally acceptable and natural by many societies. Philosophers like Aristotle defended slavery in certain forms, Religions gave it tacit approval or regulated it rather than banning it, and the economy of the ancient and early modern world was built on it. Were all those societies simply ignorant of an eternal moral truth that we moderns finally recognized? If so, objective morality did a terrible job communicating itself for most of human history. A more plausible explanation is that the moral status of slavery changed because we changed. Our understanding evolved, empathy expanded, and social structures shifted to make the practice untenable and abhorrent. We, as conscious agents, revised our collective values. This was not the discovery of a pre-existing cosmic law, it was a moral progress rooted in human contingent factors, like recognizing the common humanity of all races, economic changes that made slavery less viable, philosophical arguments about rights and dignity, etc. The same story can be told for many so-called moral truths. The rights of women, once severely limited in most societies, are now widely championed. Another radical moral shift within a mere century or two. Attitudes on issues like torture, war, punishment, sexuality, and animal welfare have all undergone transformations over time, and still vary widely across cultures. Even today, there is vast disagreement globally on moral questions. Is capital punishment justified? Is eating meat ethical? Is it ever acceptable to lie? These questions get very different answers depending on whom and where you ask. That is not what we would see if one true morality were beaming down upon us. That is what we see when morality is a human endeavor, contoured by local needs, beliefs, and experiences. Yes, there are some near-universal values like fairness, some form of the golden rule, prohibitions on indiscriminate killing, but even those universals are generally interpreted through the lens of cultural narratives. And when conflicts arise between values, different societies rank them differently, consider freedom versus security, or justice versus mercy. The illusion of moral absolutes is often sustained by looking only within one's own culture or tradition, and assuming those rules are universal. Stepping back reveals a patchwork of moral systems across the world and throughout history. This observation doesn't lead to moral nihilism, rather it leads to humility and realism about our moral convictions. We can still believe strongly in our values and fight for what we consider progress, but we do so understanding that we are participants in shaping morality, not passive discoverers of it. In fact, acknowledging the contingency of moral frameworks can foster a more empathetic and open-minded approach. It reminds us that just as our ancestors' certainties now sometimes appall us, some of our certainties may be judged harshly by future generations who develop more enlightened values. One clear emerging example is the moral status of non-human animals and artificial intelligences. Earlier chapters on the spectrum of consciousness argued that consciousness is not a black and white property exclusive to humans, but a spectrum that likely spans many creatures and potentially machines. If we take that seriously, it has direct moral implications. Beings capable of feeling and awareness deserve some degree of moral consideration. Humanity's moral circle has gradually expanded from tribe to nation to race to all humans, and now it is beginning to widen further to include other sentient beings. What once seemed absolutely acceptable, using animals solely as resources, for instance, is increasingly questioned as we recognize the continuity between their minds and ours. An objectively true morality, if it existed, would have established from the start what beings have moral worth and to what extent. Instead, we see a contingent process of moral inclusion, driven by human insights, arguments, and changing sensibilities. Our moral truths are growing up, not being unveiled, and that growth is guided by us, by our collective reasoning and feeling, rather than by the uncovering of some timeless moral reality. Realizing this liberates us from dogma. We no longer need to pretend that our current moral beliefs are the final truth written into the fabric of the cosmos. We can acknowledge them as the best we have so far, open to revision as we learn more about ourselves, each other, and the world. Morality as a human construct and necessary fiction. Stripping away the pretension of objectivity does not leave us in a moral vacuum. On the contrary, it allows us to see ethics for what it truly is, a human-constructed framework that, while not objectively ordained, is vitally important for our lives and societies. This is the paradox we must embrace. Morality is subjective in origin, yet it is also necessary. Once we accept that all moral systems are contingent creations of conscious minds, we can approach ethics pragmatically and constructively, rather than dogmatically. One way to think of morality under existential logicism is to compare it to other large-scale human constructs like language or money. No one would claim that the English language is an objective feature of the universe. Clearly, it's a product of human culture. Yet language is undeniably real in its effects and its necessity for communication. It's a shared agreement, constantly evolving, with rules that we more or less arbitrate and update as needed. Similarly, money and economic systems are made up by US paper bills, digital accounts, market rules, but they serve a function in coordinating society. We treat a dollar as having value not because of an inherent objective property, but because everyone collectively accepts the fiction of its value to facilitate trade. Morality, viewed through this lens, is like a social technology. It's a set of rules and values we agree or negotiate upon in order to live together, to reduce conflict, to promote well-being, and to coordinate actions in a complex social world. It might not be true in the sense of mirroring the universe's fabric, but it is profoundly useful and important for us as beings within the universe. Understanding morality as a construct means we can shape it deliberately. We are not bound by some cosmic moral CPU. We are the programmers. Of course, we can't just make up any rules and expect society to flourish. Moral systems are constrained by human nature, by facts of cause and effect, and by logical consistency. But within those bounds, there is flexibility. We can reason together about what values and norms serve our shared interests, and we can update those norms as conditions change, or we gain new knowledge. This perspective encourages a healthy moral adaptability. When morality is not viewed as an infallible revelation, we avoid the trap of moral absolutism that justifies atrocities because it is absolutely right, no matter the cost. Instead, we can always ask, is this moral rule achieving the outcomes we intend? Does it still make sense under current circumstances? Change it. If the answer is no, we can. Far from plunging us into chaos, a contingent view of ethics can make moral discourse more honest and productive. We stop arguing about who has God or objective truth on their side and start focusing on tangible impacts and shared values. For example, consider the justice system. If one is convinced punishment has objective moral value as retribution, an eye for an eye as an absolute principle, one might insist on harsh penalties even when they produce more harm than good. But if we see laws and punishments as tools we invented, we can evaluate them by how well they accomplish our aims, such as reducing crime, rehabilitating offenders, or protecting the public, rather than by how well they match some imagined cosmic ledger of justice. This is why many forward-thinking justice reforms emphasize harm reduction, rehabilitation, and prevention over revenge. Those approaches come from treating morality as practical and outcome-oriented, what actually helps people and society, as opposed to what fits an archaic notion of moral desert. In a world without objective sin or cosmic moral scorecards, punishment is not an end in itself, it's a means to an end, and its justification hinges on results and fairness as judged by us, not by the universe. Existential Logicism asserts that we must ground our ethics in reality, specifically in the reality of our human condition, our needs, and the logical. 196. Consequences of actions, rather than in myths. It is stronger than other views because it doesn't ask morality to do the impossible, be a magic truth from on high. It asks morality to do what it can do, help conscious agents coexist and thrive. We acknowledge that moral systems are creations of conscious agents designed for coordination and well-being. This realization doesn't weaken morality's importance, it actually makes morality ours. We take ownership of it. Just as a language belongs to its speakers, morality belongs to the community that lives it. And just as languages can be refined to communicate better, our moral systems can be improved to serve us better. We can infuse ethics with reason and compassion, not to discover absolute truth, but to better meet the goals we collectively deem worthy: happiness, reduction of suffering, justice, flourishing, whatever we decide. Importantly, recognizing contingency also imposes a kind of discipline. We can't just claim righteousness by appeal to authority or tradition. We have to justify our moral beliefs with arguments and evidence about their consequences. In a sense, we trade metaphysical legitimacy for practical legitimacy. A moral norm isn't good because it's God's command or a Platonic ideal. It's good because it demonstrably benefits people, respects conscious well-being, or logically follows from principles we've agreed to. This is a more empirical and logical approach to ethics. It aligns with the rest of our understanding of the world. We don't assume truths without. 197. Evidence elsewhere, so why should we in morality? Granted, unlike physics experiments, moral reasoning often deals with subjective values and predictions about society, but we can still observe outcomes and adapt. For instance, if we adopt a policy that we believe is ethical and it leads to misery or injustice, we have reason to reconsider that policy. In an objective morality framework, one might stubbornly stick to the policy if it was thought to be morally right by decree, even as it causes harm. The contingent approach favors moral experimentation and learning. In summary, morality as a human construct means two key things. One, we created it for our purposes, to foster cooperation, mitigate conflict, and express our shared aspirations. And two, we are responsible for it, for maintaining it, for changing it when needed, and for living up to it since nothing else will enforce it for us. It becomes a kind of necessary fiction, not objectively real, yet necessary to navigate the human experience. Understanding this frees us from chasing moral mirages and lets us focus on what actually matters, making ethical choices that improve lives in the here and now. We can still hold our moral principles dear, but with the wisdom that comes from knowing they are principles we choose and uphold, not commandments etched by the universe. Conclusion: severing the reality illusion. Embracing. The Contingency Guillotine delivers a sharp verdict. All moral systems, even those cloaked in the language of universality, are born of minds and depend on minds. The dream of an objective morality, a set of absolute rules that exist independent of any observer, cannot survive this scrutiny. If morality needed no minds, we would find moral truths as unalterable and evident as the laws of physics. Instead, we find moral truths that must be taught, debated, justified, and interpreted. If morality were truly objective, it would be the same for all cultures and eras, but it is not. If it were objective, it would never require defending or interpreting. Yet every moral principle comes with commentaries and controversies. In short, if morality were objective, it would not look the way actual morality does. Reality shows us contingent moral beliefs all the way down. By cutting away the illusion of objectivity, we do not destroy morality, we liberate it from false pretenses. What remains is morality understood as a human and possibly wider than human phenomenon, flexible, adaptable, and deeply important for conscious beings trying to coexist. Freed from the need to be ultimate, ethics can focus on being effective. This is a cornerstone of the philosophy of existential logicism, confronting comforting illusions with hard logic and then rebuilding our understanding on a foundation of reason and lived reality. We have seen that moral objectivity was a phantom, now we replace it with moral responsibility. That is, we accept that it's up to us, our reason, our empathy, our collective decision-making, to craft the best moral framework we can. There is no external guarantee that our morals are correct. There is only the test of time and consequence. Do our principles lead to better lives and less suffering? Do they cohere with our other well-founded knowledge? Those are questions we can answer and continuously refine. Importantly, recognizing the contingency of morality also forces us to grapple with free will and moral responsibility in a new light. If our moral choices are not guided by an external absolute, and if, as earlier chapters have explored, our actions arise from a chain of prior causes and conditions, what does it mean to hold someone accountable? Traditional notions of moral responsibility often presume that individuals are ultimate originators of their actions, free to have done otherwise in an absolute sense. But a logical, deterministic view of the world challenges that assumption. We begin to see bad actions not as transgressions against a cosmic law, but as events caused by a complex interplay of biology, environment, and circumstance. This doesn't mean we abandon the idea of responsibility. It means we redefine it in terms of causality and influence rather than desert and blame. The next chapter, Deterministic Moral Forces, will take up this thread. Building on the Contingency Guillotine, it will examine how morality operates when we acknowledge that human behavior is fully caused, not free from causation, and that our task is to steer those causes toward compassionate outcomes. In a determined universe with no objective moral referee, moral agents become like players in a grand physics of will, where understanding the forces at play can empower us to engineer more ethical societies. Thus, the Contingency Guillotine doesn't leave us in despair. It invites us into a clearer, if more challenging, view of ethical life. We trade the false comfort of absolute moral truth for the authentic responsibility of creating meaning and value through our choices. In doing so, we remain true to the commitments of existential logicism to face existence as it is, without myths, but with unflinching logic, and to find our guiding principles from that reality. All morality may indeed be subjective, but it is our subjectivity, and therein lies the power. What is contingent can be changed, improved, and continuously aligned with our deepest understanding of the world and ourselves. The guillotine has fallen on objective morality. Now we continue forward, conscious that we alone must carry the banner of ethics and determined to carry it wisely. Now that morality has been severed from any objective root, we must ask what grows in its place. This is the final turn toward a determined but not meaningless ethics. Existential logicism's final pillar, all morality, behavior, and even punishment are products of deterministic forces. In the aftermath of the Contingency Guillotine, we find ourselves in a moral landscape stripped of any objective, preordained law. The previous chapter dismantled the illusion of an absolute morality by showing that every ought ultimately rests on a contingent human value or assumption. With that objective foundation cut away, we now turn to what fills the void. Deterministic moral forces is the answer. A framework asserting that morality is not a divine command or cosmic truth, but an emergent product of cause and effect. This final pillar of existential logicism argues that all our moral judgments, behaviors, and systems of justice flow from deterministic processes. In other words, morality is not something we choose freely or discover in nature, but something we inevitably produce given the way reality is structured. This chapter will build directly on the previous insights. Having accepted that there is no objective moral law handed down from on high, we embrace a deterministic, ethical framework rooted in real-world consequences. We will explore the illusion of free will and how it has distorted our notions of praise, blame, and just deserts. We will see that even as we strive to act morally, our actions are wholly shaped by causality. Our choices are choices in name only, unfolding from prior events. Paradoxically, by accepting this, we do not undermine morality, but reinforce it. Determined morality can still guide us, more effectively in fact, because it is grounded in reality. We will also introduce how this framework resolves the infamous is-ought problem in a novel way. This is not presented as some grand new moral commandment, but as a natural consequence of existential logicism's structure. A compelling byproduct that shows how ought can be rooted in is once we view morality through the lens of determinism. Along the way, we'll use practical examples like the classic trolley problem to illustrate how a deterministic view brings moral clarity that traditional systems, whether based on objective rules or retributive instincts, lack. We will argue that retributive punishment becomes irrational even on its own terms, especially once one acknowledges the causal forces behind behaviour. And throughout, we'll reinforce the vision of moral structure not as a top-down decree or a matter of subjective whim, but as an emergent pattern of deterministic systems interacting. By the end of this chapter, the aim is to see morality in a new light, not as a mysterious absolute or a mere personal preference, but as a determined functional construct, real and necessary, yet entirely born from the interplay of cause and effect. The Contingency Guillotine, the end of objective morality. Before diving into determinism, let's recap why we've abandoned the idea of objective morality in the first place. The Contingency Guillotine is the principle that any moral rule or value that hinges on something changeable, some contingency, cannot be truly objective or universal. In simple terms, if a moral claim depends on any external condition, a human desire, a divine command, a particular outcome, then it's not an independent truth carved into the fabric of the universe. It is contingent, and the guillotine falls, severing its claim to objectivity. David Hume's is-ought problem was our starting point. Hume pointed out that you cannot logically derive an ought, a moral prescription, solely from an is, a statement of fact. Traditional moral systems always have to sneak in some value assumption to bridge the gap. For example, a moral realist might say, suffering is bad fact, therefore we ought to reduce suffering moral duty. But as Hume noted, the notion that suffering is bad is not a factual statement about the world, it's a value judgment. The Contingency Guillotine made this even more explicit. Any attempt to claim an objective moral truth runs into the question objectively true according to whom. Remove the observer or the context, and the supposed truth evaporates. Let's illustrate the downfall of objective morality. Unreligious morality claims that moral truths come from a deity. But this is contingent on the existence and nature of that deity. If morality depends on God's command, it's essentially true only given God's preferences. It's not an independent truth of physics or logic. Change or remove the deity, and the moral law changes or disappears. That contingency means it cannot be objective in the philosophical sense, and secular moral realism. For example, utilitarianism, grounded in well-being, claims that things like pain is bad or happiness is good are objective facts. Yet, as we argued, pain and suffering, while very real experiences, do not carry intrinsic moral weight until we decide they do. Saying pain is bad is a reflection of our human preference to avoid pain, not a statement that the universe magically condemns pain. If an alien with a completely different biology wouldn't agree, then it's not universal. Moral values based on well-being are contingent on human nature and human wants. They make sense for us, but they are not written into the cosmos. Evolutionary or rationalist ethics, some argue morality could be objective because evolution or pure reason dictates certain behaviours like cooperation. But again, these are contingent on the particulars of human evolution or on assumptions about what is rational. Change the environment or the premises, and the moral truth changes. In every case, what we call moral truth turns out to be dependent on something else, a mind to value it, a culture to support it, a goal to justify it. This is the contingency guillotine's cut. If a moral law needs anything outside itself to hold true, it is not an independent, objective fact. An objective morality would have to be true in a vacuum, with no contingent factors, but no moral claim meets that standard. Thou shalt not kill sounds absolute, but would that hold as a moral truth in a universe with no living beings? The moment you add because it causes suffering, or God said so, or society will collapse, you have introduced a contingency. Thus, we concluded that objective morality is an illusion. There is no external, context-free source of right and wrong. Morality is inherently a human, or at least mind-dependent construct. But this does not mean morality doesn't exist, or that we should succumb to chaos. It just means morality must be understood in different terms. If not objective, what is it? The answer, morality is a construct that arises from the deterministic nature of reality and human beings within it. It is a product of facts, not an escape from them. To get there, we first need to examine the role of determinism and the myth of free will, because the death of objective morality and the birth of a deterministic ethics are deeply intertwined. Deterministic moral forces, but if morality isn't objective law, how can I know that I shouldn't kick babies? Our core thesis is simple. Morality is deterministic, not objective. All moral behaviour and judgments are the inevitable outcomes of prior causes, not the result of free choice or discovery of universal truths. What does this mean? It means that when you make a moral decision, you are not plucking a choice from some mystical realm of freedom. Every decision you make is an outcome of a chain of events. Your genetics, your upbringing, your culture, your current neurochemical state, All the variables that come together to produce you also produce your choices. If we could somehow rewind the universe to the exact same initial conditions, you would make the exact same decisions every time. This includes your deepest moral convictions and the split-second choices where you decide between right and wrong. In a very real sense, you cannot do otherwise than what you do. This deterministic view might sound bleak or mechanistic, but let's unpack it step by step. Will exists, but it's entirely caused. We obviously experience making choices. Should I lie in this situation or tell the truth? Should I donate to charity or save my money? We deliberate, we feel conflicted, we exercise our will. Determinism doesn't deny the experience of choosing, it reframes it. The feeling of deliberation is your brain processing various causal inputs, weighing memories, feelings, anticipated outcomes, according to its wiring. There is no separate, ghost-like free will outside this causal process. The will you experience is real, but it's a determined will, molded by everything that led up to that moment. Moral norms arise from necessity, not freedom. If our decisions are determined, then moral rules, the principles society holds to, are not freely invented either. Instead, societies develop moral norms because those norms serve a function. For example, why do virtually all societies have some form of rule against murder or theft? Not because everyone independently, freely decided yes, that is objectively wrong, but because any society that didn't discourage murder would fall apart. Certain behaviors lead to stability and prosperity, others lead to chaos. Over time, cause and effect teach any group of humans that some rules are necessary for survival. Thus, morality emerges as an effect of our circumstances. We don't choose it, we grow into it. And morality is an emergent property of deterministic systems. Of deterministic systems. Just as crystal patterns emerge from the deterministic interactions of molecules, moral patterns emerge from the interactions of humans. Think of morality as akin to language. Humans did not sit down as a species and arbitrarily pick a language system. Languages evolved naturally as a solution to communication needs. They are not objectively true or false, there's no inherently truest language, but they are highly structured and rule-governed, arising from human social interaction. Morality works much the same way. It's not written into the stars, but it's also not random. It's an emergent, structured phenomenon that any sufficiently advanced social species would develop, given similar needs and constraints. Crucially, this doesn't make morality meaningless or trivial. On the contrary, it gives morality a concrete foundation in reality. Instead of being a mysterious commandment from the sky or a purely personal opinion, morality becomes something we can study, understand, and improve upon like any other phenomenon. If moral choices are determined, then morality is basically a branch of causality. We can analyze what causes certain moral outcomes, what rules lead to better societal functioning, and so on, with the same empirical mindset we bring to biology or physics. To say morality is deterministic is also to say moral responsibility takes on a new meaning. It's not about a metaphysical freedom to have done otherwise, it's about being the link in a chain that leads to certain outcomes. We still hold people, 209, responsible in the sense that their actions have consequences, and we often must address those actions. But we no longer see responsibility as a moral weight on a soul. Instead, it is a pragmatic identification of cause and effect. If someone's action caused harm, we respond not because they freely chose evil, but because we want to prevent such harm in the future or correct the conditions that led to it. This core thesis, that morality is a determined, emergent system, turns the traditional view on its head. Traditionally, people assume morality is only meaningful if we have free will and if some things are objectively right or wrong. We are now proposing the exact opposite. Morality actually becomes clearer and more coherent once we accept that it's entirely determined and not objectively mandated. But to appreciate that, we must first deal with the big elephant in the room, free will. After all, if free will doesn't exist, what happens to the idea of choosing to do right or wrong? Let's confront that directly. The illusion of free will and the collapse of moral blame. Just hurt them because it feels good, not because it solves anything. One of the strongest intuitive objections to a deterministic morality is, doesn't morality require free will? If nobody has free choice, how can anyone be blamed or praised? How can we have things like justice or moral effort or the sense of duty? These questions are valid. Entire moral philosophies are built on the assumption of free will. However, if free will is an illusion, then those philosophies need a complete overhaul. And indeed, free will is an illusion, at least in the traditional sense of an uncaused chooser inside us. Let's clarify what we mean by free will being an illusion. In the classic view, free will means that at any given moment, a person could have done otherwise than what they did, independent of all prior causes. It posits a kind of mental spontaneity that is neither random nor determined, a magical ability to just choose. Determinism flatly denies this. Every action you take is the only action you could have taken, given the circumstances. This is not to say you were coerced by an external force in that moment, but rather that you, your brain, your psyche, were always going to make exactly that choice because of who you are and what you knew and felt at that time, all of which are products of prior causes. Consider a simple example. A teenager commits an act of vandalism. Traditional thinking might say they knew it was wrong but freely chose to do it, so they are morally blameworthy. A deterministic view says what factors led this teenager to that action? Perhaps a need for peer approval, a lack of understanding of consequences, an impulsive personality shaped by genetics and upbringing, etc. If we rewind the scenario with all those factors unchanged, do we really think the teenager would spontaneously choose not to vandalize? Likely not. They did it because of those influencing factors. No spooky free will needed. A cause and effect chain explains it. Science bolsters this view. Neurological studies have shown that the brain initiates actions before our conscious mind decides to do them, indicating that our feeling of freely willing an action is a reconstruction, not the actual origin. Psychological studies show how people's choices can be predicted above chance by their patterns of past behavior and environmental cues. Even our deepest sense of self, the kind of person we strive to be, is shaped by genes and experiences, none of which we chose before we existed. Now, if we accept that free will in the strong metaphysical sense doesn't exist, what happens to moral responsibility? At first glance, it seems to collapse entirely. Traditional moral responsibility is built on the idea that an individual could have done otherwise. We praise the hero because he didn't have to risk himself to save others, but he chose to. We blame the villain because she could have done good, but she chose evil. Remove the could have, and those judgments falter. If the hero literally could not have acted differently because every neuron in his brain, every aspect of his character determined that he would act heroically, then is his heroism really something to praise in the sense of taking personal credit? It's admirable and beneficial, yes, but praise in the sense of you deserve a reward because you went above and beyond what was required no longer applies. He acted as he was bound to act. If the criminal could not have refrained from crime, given her life circumstances, psychology, etc., then blaming and punishing in the sense of you chose wrong and must suffer for it loses justification. The criminal did wrong, but not as a freely willing sinner, more like a faulty cog in a machine or a boulder that rolled down a hill and crushed something in its path. You don't morally blame the boulder, you figure out why it rolled and how to prevent future rock slides. This realization leads to a dramatic shift. Retributive justice becomes irrational under determinism.
Okay, that paused naturally anyway. I just want to mention that the part here about about justice, maybe the most jarring part of the whole thing. But hear it out and understand what we're saying. We're not getting rid of crime and punishment and responsibility. We're trying to reframe them in ways that are more helpful. But I'll fix the skip right now.
Suffering on someone because they deserve it for making a bad choice. But if there was no true free choice, the notion of desert, what one deserves, is fundamentally altered. Does a person deserve punishment in a cosmic moral sense if their actions were the product of a million antecedent causes? We would argue no. Punishment might still have a role, more on that later, but not as moral retribution. Even many who believe in free will already intuit parts of this. Consider how our legal systems handle people with severe mental illness. If someone commits a harmful act but is found to be psychotic or not in control of their mind, we often judge them not guilty by reason of insanity. Why? Because we implicitly recognize that their action did not flow from a free, conscious choice in the normal way. It was caused by factors, brain chemistry, delusions outside what we consider the person's control. In other words, we acknowledge determinism's impact in extreme cases by saying the person lacked full responsibility. But here's the rub. All actions are caused by something. The difference between the sane and the insane, or the well-raised and the badly raised, is a difference in the causes, not a difference between having causes or not. So, if we admit that a schizophrenic's violent act was not a freely chosen evil, why do we insist that a clear-headed criminal's act was freely chosen? The clear-headed criminal's choices were shaped by their brain state, life history, and circumstances. 214. Just as much, the chain of causality is simply more socially typical. This illustrates a key point. Even under free will-based frameworks, whenever we acknowledge that circumstances influence behavior, we are halfway to a deterministic view. Many traditional moralists want to have it both ways. Normal people have free will and deserve what they get, except if factors A, B, or C impaired their judgment. But once you let A, B, and C, be it mental illness or abuse history or social pressure, into the equation, you're admitting that causality matters. Deterministic morality just carries this reasoning to its logical conclusion. Causality is all that matters. Moral responsibility in the old sense, as a metaphysical guilt or merit, evaporates completely. What collapses along with it are praise and blame as we traditionally conceive them. This can be unsettling. Do we not thank and laud people who do good? Do we not hold people accountable for doing bad? The deterministic view doesn't say we must stop reacting emotionally to good or bad deeds. Those reactions are determined too, but it says we should reinterpret what those reactions mean. Instead of praising someone as a hero who could have selfishly fled but bravely didn't, we are expressing appreciation for the positive impact of their determined character and actions, reinforcing those behaviors in society. Instead of blaming someone as a villain who perversely chose harm, we express disapproval to signal that. 215. Such behavior has no place in society and to motivate corrective measures. In both cases, we're doing it for functional reasons, not because we're delivering cosmic justice. In summary, free will's absence radically changes our moral calculus. No one could have done otherwise. This means no one is fundamentally blameworthy or praiseworthy for being exactly who they are. You did what you had to do, and so did everyone else. Retribution is unjustified. Punishing people purely to give them what they deserve makes no sense when what they deserve wasn't up to them. The only rationales for punishment that remain are those that serve some forward-looking purpose, deterrence, rehabilitation, or incapacitation to protect others. Praise and blame become tools, not truths. We might still use the language of praise or blame, but with the understanding that we are like trainers rewarding a dog or correcting behavior, not like judges weighing independent free choices. This shift is profound. It takes morality off the pedestal of metaphysics and plants it squarely in the realm of natural cause and effect. The old framework has indeed collapsed. We cannot keep talking about morality the way we used to. But this is not the end of ethics, far from it. In losing the illusion of free will, we gain a new perspective on why morality matters and how it operates. We start focusing on outcomes and causes instead of intent and sin. We start asking, what will reduce harm or increase well-being going forward, instead of who deserves to be punished or rewarded for what they've done. Most importantly, we don't actually lose the experience of decision-making or the need to guide behavior. We still have goals, we still deliberate on how to achieve them, and we still need principles to coordinate our actions with others. Determinism doesn't make us passive robots, it just tells us why we do what we do. In fact, it empowers us to do better once we understand those determinants. This leads us to the next key idea. Even without free will, morality not only persists, it thrives as a concept of practical necessity. Morality as an emergent necessity, why morality still matters. So, free will is an illusion, and objective morality is a myth. Does this mean morality is out the window as well? Should we all become nihilists, claiming nothing matters and there's no reason to prefer kindness over cruelty? Absolutely not. Morality remains vitally important, but its importance comes not from obeying some cosmic law or exercising free choice, rather from the pragmatic needs of living in a determined reality. The key realization is that even a world without free will needs ethical behavior. Why? Because actions still have consequences. We are still beings with desires, capable of suffering and joy, living together in societies. None of that is negated by determinism. If anything, determinism makes those realities more stark, given that things will unfold cause by cause. If we want good outcomes, we have to intentionally cultivate the right causes. Morality then becomes the study and practice of influencing outcomes for the better. Think of morality as a social technology, a set of rules and norms that human groups develop in order to function. Every society has something we'd recognize as morality, because any society that completely lacked norms would tear itself apart. This is not because the universe commands thou shalt have morality, but because of natural selection and necessity. A community that allowed limitless murder, theft, deceit, etc. would not last. Moral norms emerge because they make societies viable. In this sense, morality is comparable to language, money, or laws. Human constructs, but indispensable ones. We made them up, but not arbitrarily. We made them up under pressure from reality. Some points to underscore why morality still matters and isn't just imaginary. Gas of stability and survival are non-negotiable. Humans and any agents are deterministically driven to survive, avoid pain, and seek well-being. These drives are built into us by evolution and conditioning. We don't choose them. Given those drives, certain patterns of behavior, moral ones, like cooperation, non-violence, fairness, naturally promote stability and thriving, whereas rampant violence and betrayal do not. So, even without any objective decree, there's a deterministic push towards moral behavior. Groups that figure out cooperative rules will outlast and outperform those that don't. In this way, morality is an inevitable product of our situation, an emergent property of human interaction that serves our determined interests. Ought arises from is when the is includes our needs. In a vacuum, it's true you can't say people ought to do X just from facts. But in reality, there is never a vacuum. The facts always include what people want and need. We'll delve deeper into as we sort in the next section, but the short version is, because we factually are the kinds of beings who prefer certain states of the world, statements about what we ought to do can be interpreted as statements about how to achieve those preferred states. For instance, people ought not torture each other isn't an objective cosmic truth, but it's a very sensible rule given that A, people universally suffer from extreme pain, fact, and B, we seek to avoid suffering, another fact. It's a rule that deterministic forces, our biology and social dynamics, make us value. Only morality is about prediction and control, not blame. Instead of viewing morality as a ledger of credits and debits on people's souls, we view it as a kind of predictive science. We want to know, if we encourage action A, what will happen? If we discourage action B, what will happen? Moral principles become like hypotheses about social cause and effect. For example, if we foster trust and punish lying, our community will prosper. That's a testable claim in a way. And indeed, over centuries, humans have empirically found that certain moral arrangements produce better outcomes, more peace, more prosperity. So morality still matters because it's the guiding system for human flourishing. We ignore it at our peril, not because of divine wrath, but because of natural consequences. Emergent does not mean arbitrary. A common misconception, if morality isn't objective, then it's just anything goes. But just because something is a human construct doesn't mean all constructs are equal. Chess is a human construct. Someone made up the rules, but not any random set of rules makes a playable game. Language is constructed, but you can't just randomly assign sounds to meanings and expect to communicate. Languages evolve under constraints and pressures, ease of learning, distinctiveness of words, etc. Likewise, moral systems are constrained by human nature and the realities of cause and effect. There is a structured, limited space of viable moral systems, and we can objectively study which ones lead to which results. In that sense, morality can be seen as subjective in origin, but objective in operation. We invent a rule, and then it either works, contributes to well-being, stability, or it doesn't, based on objective outcomes. Over time, the rules that work tend to stick around. This is why independent cultures often converge on similar basic moral tenets: don't kill, don't steal, value honesty. Not because these are written in the stars, but because those are the functional solutions in any human society. To drive home the point, morality is real, but its reality is that of an emergent pattern, not a fundamental law. Consider the example of, if you want a stable society, you ought to discourage random violence. This statement requires no appeal to higher authority. It's practically tautological once you understand the terms. A stable society, by definition, cannot coexist with unchecked violence. We don't need to say violence is cosmically evil. It's enough that violence causes suffering and chaos facts, and that humans avoid suffering and chaos fact. Thus, a norm against violence emerges inexorably. You could drop a human community on a desert island, and given enough time, they will develop rules. And almost certainly, don't murder will be among them. Not because someone pontificated from first principles, but because if they don't, they won't survive as a community. It's worth noting that Existential Logicism's deterministic morality navigates between two extremes. It avoids the trap of moral objectivism, pretending moral laws exist outside of human contexts, and equally avoids the abyss of moral subjectivism where anything goes. We reject moral objectivism because of the contingency. 221. Argument: we know moral rules need minds and context, but we also reject the idea that morality is just whimsical or purely personal choice. A person can believe whatever they want about right and wrong, but if their beliefs don't align with the deterministic realities of human social life, those beliefs will fail the test of implementation. For example, someone might claim, I think strength is the only virtue and kindness is weakness, but if they try to structure a society that way, it will likely collapse or be plagued by violence. In a very real sense, morality is constrained by what reality allows. There is a natural spectrum of moral strategies that work for creatures like us, and straying too far outside that either into cruel tyranny or into anarchy or what have you typically leads to self-destruction of that society. Thus, morality may be subjective in its starting point. It starts from human needs and perspectives, but it is objective in its consequences. Some moral arrangements objectively produce better results given those starting points. In summary, morality matters without free will because morality was never fundamentally about free will in the first place. It was about navigating a world of causes and effects to achieve what we care about: peace, happiness, life. Those cares are determined, the navigation can be studied, and the stakes are real. The illusion was thinking that morality needed some metaphysical freedom or external validation to function. It doesn't. As determined beings, we still need to know how to live together and prosper, and deterministic moral forces give us a way to understand that process. Having established that an ethics grounded in determinism is both necessary and meaningful, we can now tackle a claim that few philosophies dare to: bridging the gap between is and ought. In our framework, the so-called gap is not a chasm at all, but a continuum, because what is includes the seeds of what we call ought. Bridging the is-ought divide. Build bridges, don't burn them. Philosophers have long been haunted by the gulf between describing the world and prescribing how it should be. In our deterministic framework, we have a fresh angle on this old problem. The trick is understanding that once you strip away the mystique around ought statements can be seen as a special kind of is statement, specifically an is statement about what will reliably lead to desired outcomes. To say you ought to do X traditionally implies some independent moral imperative, but in a deterministic system, we reinterpret it as shorthand for a chain of cause and effect facts. If you do X, then given the way the world works, outcome Y will occur, which we deterministically desire or value. Therefore, you, if you are an agent who desires Y, will be driven to do 10th. It sounds a bit convoluted, but it's actually much more intuitive in practice. Let's break down the logic stepwise to see how an ought can emerge from pure facts. Agents have inherent goals and needs. It is the case that humans, as well as any similar agents, strive for certain things: survival, safety, well-being, social belonging. We don't choose to have these basic drives, they come built in from biology and socialization. This is a factual statement about what humans are like. 2. Certain actions reliably lead toward or away from those goals. It is the case that some behaviors produce outcomes that fulfill human needs, and others produce outcomes that thwart them. For instance, it is the case that a society in which people habitually murder each other will be unstable and full of fear, contrary to the goal of safety. It is the case that if people generally keep their promises, trust and cooperation become possible, aiding well-being and social harmony. 3. Societies and individuals naturally form norms based on those cause and effect relationships. It is the case that over time, communities develop rules like don't kill and keep your promises precisely because those rules serve the outcomes everyone inherently wants. These norms are not arbitrary, they are moulded by the pressure of reality. Even if no one initially articulated you ought not kill, people who gratuitously kill would face backlash and exclusion because their actions have negative effects. Thus, behavioral norms against killing take shape. This is a descriptive account of norm formation. Now we phrase the prescription, you ought not do 10th. What this really means in our framework is, doing X will lead to outcomes that undermine the shared needs and desires that you and everyone have. Therefore, by the logical structure of those needs, you will be punished or see harm if you do 10th. In other words, given what is true about your nature and the world, you should avoid X if you want things to go well. And since wanting things to go well is not optional, it's determined by our nature, the ought carries force. It's inescapable in context. Let's use a concrete example to illustrate this derivation. Fact 1. Humans living in society benefit from security and trust. We are safer and happier when we don't fear being harmed by others. Fact 2. Random murder undermines security and trust, leading to chaos and suffering. Fact 3. Therefore, any society of humans will enforce through determined reactions a norm against murder to maintain stability. People who murder will face consequences, legal punishment, community retaliation, etc. because of how humans collectively respond to protect themselves. Ought. If you are a human in society, which means you are subject to those collective forces, and you yourself need the society to be stable, you ought not to murder. This ought isn't coming from a mystical moral realm, it's coming from the very practical reality that murdering will bring about your own ruin and others as well. It's a conditional ought with universally true conditions. Virtually everyone wants to live and not be murdered, and that doesn't hinge on personal opinion. It's a feature of human organisms. Notice that we didn't slip in any new value beyond what is already implicit in the facts. We didn't say life is sacred or murder is inherently evil. We said we want to live a fact. Murder causes instability and death a fact. Therefore we form a norm. Against murder, a fact. And so anyone who contemplates murder ought to expect negative consequences and the destruction of what they care about. In this way, the ought becomes nothing more and nothing less than a recognition of the deterministic forces at play. It is correct, as a matter of fact, to say you ought not murder. In the same way, it's correct to say if you touch a hot stove, you'll burn yourself, so you shouldn't do that. The shouldn't is not an independent moral truth, it's advice derived from cause and effect. Yet it carries a normative weight because we all have skin in the game, literally, in the stove example, and figuratively in society's case. To put this formally, consider the following chain of reasoning in our deterministic moral framework. 1. It is the case that humans, as determined beings, strive for certain conditions, survival, stability, well-being. 2. It is the case that certain actions, like widespread violence or deceit, reliably lead to the breakdown of those conditions. 3. It is the case that humans collectively develop pressures, laws, punishments, moral disapproval to discourage those detrimental actions and encourage behaviors that support survival and stability. 4. Therefore, it is the case that any given individual human exists under those pressures and with those innate drives. 5. Therefore, that individual ought to avoid the detrimental actions because everything in their reality, from their own needs to society's responses, pushes toward avoiding those actions. Step 5 is an ought that has been entirely derived from a series of IS statements. It does not require us to appeal to any value outside the system. The values survival, etc., are themselves facts of what humans are. The ought is essentially an emergent property of a cluster of is statements. It's like saying, given what a heart is, 227, and does, it ought to pump blood, meaning if it doesn't, the organism will suffer. No one would say a failing heart is immoral, but we can certainly say it's not doing what it ought to for the organism to live. In moral context, ought has that same functional character in our view. It's important to stress that this resolves Hume's problem in a practical sense. But we are not claiming to have created an objective moral truth out of thin air. Rather, we've shown that when you fully account for reality, including human nature, the separation between facts and values diminishes. Values themselves are a kind of fact. Facts about what creatures desire. And once those are on the table, bridging to an ought is no leap at all. Hume's point was that you can't get an ought from an is if you ignore the implicit wants or goals. We are simply putting those wants explicitly into the equation and showing that within a deterministic framework, those wants are non-optional. One could object, isn't this just a hypothetical imperative? If you want X, then you ought to do Y. What if I don't want X? In our framework, for fundamental things like survival and avoiding pain, not wanting X is generally not an option for any functioning human. You can say you don't care about living or stability, but as long as you behave like a human, your biology and subconscious will assert those drives. And indeed, if someone truly lacks all the usual human drives, say they have a condition that makes them feel no pain, no fear of 228, death, etc., then moral communication with them fails in any framework, not just ours. They become something like an alien or a psychopath with whom negotiation is extremely difficult. The deterministic framework doesn't magically convert those who fundamentally don't share human drives, it just speaks to the vast majority of us who do. Another objection might be, but what if someone's determined goal is something awful, like they want chaos or enjoy causing pain? There are two responses. First, such desires usually stem from some pathology or extreme circumstance, deterministic causes we might address or treat. Second, even if an individual here or there wants chaos, the rest of society's deterministic forces, our combined desire for stability, will check that individual. They will either be stopped, isolated, or their behaviour rendered costly to them. So the ought for them, you ought not cause chaos, is enforced by reality in the form of consequences, even if they personally don't subscribe to it. They might not agree, but they can't escape the reality that trying to live by a contrary ought, like I ought to sow chaos, will bring them into conflict with larger forces and likely lead to their own ruin. Thus the deterministic ought proves itself inexorable. Ignore it at your peril. In effect, we've made moral oughts into a subset of practical rationality. If you understand how the world works, you'll see that you ought to behave in certain ways to get the results you ineluctably want. This approach means we haven't invented any new moral commandment. We've only clarified why moral imperatives have the force they do. They feel compelling not because they float down from heaven, but because they are wired into the consequence matrix of our lives. It is, in a sense, reassuring. You don't follow morality to appease a god or an abstraction. You follow it because it's the roadmap to a functioning society and personal well-being, and those are things you care about because you're human. Let's wrap this up with a powerful metaphor, the rock rolling down the hill. If a boulder is tumbling toward a village, we don't pause to ask what the rock ought to do or blame the rock for being bad. We simply act. The rock must be diverted or stopped to prevent harm. Now consider a human who is on a path due to whatever causes to do violence or cause harm. In the old framework, we'd say he ought not do that, and if he does, we blame and punish. In the deterministic framework, that statement he ought not is more like a warning. If he continues, the deterministic forces of society, police, etc., will stop him or punish him, and a lot of suffering will happen. It's a predictive statement. His action is against the collective stability, and thus will meet resistance. Ideally, we stop it before it happens, just as we would with a rock. In this way, ought becomes almost interchangeable with necessary if we want to avoid disaster. We've effectively solved the is ought problem by dissolving it. Oughts are not mysterious extra properties. They are embedded in the fabric of is. Once is includes all relevant facts about human nature and goals. We no longer have to smuggle in values surreptitiously. We acknowledge them as determined facts and proceed logically. This careful framing shows that our approach provides a compelling resolution to a centuries-old philosophical quandary. But we emphasize it's a byproduct of our system, not a proclamation of absolute truth. We haven't declared thou shalt not murder as an objective law. We've explained why you ought not murder will hold as a rule in any human context. That is immensely powerful, arguably more powerful than an objective law, because it doesn't rely on faith in something unseen. It relies only on understanding the reality of human life. With this understanding of how morality can be grounded in determinism, we can more confidently contrast our framework with the traditional moral doctrines it aims to replace. It's time to show how deterministic moral forces transcends the old ethical systems, deontological, utilitarian, religious, resolving their contradictions and pitfalls. Transcending traditional ethics, why determinism outperforms old doctrines. Most established ethical theories were built on the foundations we've just shaken, free will and objective values. It's no surprise then that those theories encounter serious problems. By viewing morality through the deterministic lens, we can see why those traditional frameworks fail and how our approach avoids their traps. Let's briefly examine a few of these classic systems. Kantian deontology, duty ethics. Immanuel Kant argued that moral duties are derived from rationality and must hold universally for all free rational agents. His famous categorical imperative says we should only act according to maxims we could will as universal laws. The glaring issue here is the assumption of free rational agency. Kant's whole moral castle is built on the idea that we can choose to follow duty out of pure reason. If, as we've argued, no one truly has the freedom to do otherwise than they do, then Kant's imperative loses its footing. There are no absolutely free rational agents in our world, only determined ones. Does that make Kantian rules useless? Not entirely. One can still find pragmatic value in, say, the rule don't lie because it leads to trust. But the justification for following the rule is different. Kant wanted it to be an unconditional logical requirement. Deterministic moral forces says it's a conditional causal necessity. Kantian ethics also struggles with conflicts of duties and often ignores outcomes entirely. For Kant, lying was wrong even to save a life, a rigid stance many find counterintuitive. Our framework handles such nuances better by focusing on causality and outcomes rather than absolutes. In short, Kant's system presupposes a kind of moral freedom we don't have, whereas DMF preserves the structure of ethical rules, don't lie, don't kill, but grounds them in reality. Utilitarianism, consequentialism, utilitarian ethics, associated with thinkers like John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, says that the morally right action is the one that maximizes overall well-being, happiness, pleasure, etc., and minimizes suffering. On the surface, this might seem compatible with our outcome-focused approach. Indeed, deterministic moral forces also cares about outcomes. We want to promote well-being and reduce harm because that's what humans deterministically value. The difference is subtle but important. Utilitarianism often treats maximize happiness as if it were an objective imperative in itself. It's like a math formula everyone ought to follow. But why ought we maximize happiness? Utilitarians might say because happiness is inherently good, that inherently is where they quietly assume a value. In our framework, happiness isn't inherently good as a cosmic truth. It's good because we beings desire it due to who we are. We rephrase maximize well-being into a descriptive principle. People will tend to enforce behaviors that increase well-being because it serves their nature. Also, classical utilitarianism can get very abstract and sometimes counterintuitive, e.g., scenarios like sacrificing one innocent person to save. Many utilitarianism says yes, do it, which conflicts with many people's moral intuition or right-space thinking. The deterministic view can reach similar conclusions about sacrificing one for many when necessary, but it doesn't claim it's because of an objective utility calculus. It's because, causally, saving more lives at the cost of fewer aligns with the overall drive of a society to preserve itself. Our framework yields utilitarian-flavored outcomes without committing to utilitarianism's assumption that maximum utility is a standalone moral truth. We ground it instead. Why maximize well-being? Because that's literally what every person and society is going to try to do by their nature. Religious or divine command ethics. Religious morality posits that moral rules come from a deity or scripture. X is wrong because God says so, or we have these commandments that define good and evil. We've partly covered this under the Contingency Guillotine discussion. Divine commands are by nature contingent on God's existence and will. But from a deterministic perspective, there's another angle. Even if a God exists, followers still only adhere to moral rules because of deterministic factors. A believer obeys a commandment due to upbringing, fear of punishment, hope for reward, psychological propensity for faith, etc., all causes. It's not like the existence of a divine rule suddenly grants humans free will to follow it. They will follow or not follow based on causes, which believers might call grace or temptation or whatnot, but those are just other words for influences. So a deterministic analysis can actually include religious moral behavior. Why do certain moral norms endure? Because religions have served as vehicles for social cohesion, etc. But importantly, we do not need a divine command to explain morality. As we've shown, societies will develop don't kill, don't steal, be fair on their own, because such rules work. Religions often codified these, adding supernatural justification to ensure compliance, but the underlying reason the rules make sense is not because God said so, but because of their earthly effects. Moreover, if a purported divine command goes against human well-being, say, a command to persecute a minority, deterministic morality would judge it by its consequences, suffering, conflict, and find it wanting, whereas a pure divine command theory would force adherence regardless of harm. In DMF, no rule, not even sacred ones, is above evaluation by consequences and causal reality. This makes it more adaptable and humane, whereas religious systems can become cruel or outdated if followed dogmatically. In highlighting these, we see a common thread. Traditional systems assume or require something unprovable, free will, intrinsic values, a god to get off the ground. They also tend to encounter dilemmas and contradictions. Deontology can be inflexible, never lie, even if lying saves a life. Utilitarianism can justify troubling actions, sacrifice one for many, even in cold-blooded ways. Religion can sanctify harmful practices, holy wars, discrimination believed to be divinely sanctioned. Deterministic moral forces, by contrast, is both more modest and more consistent. And we assume nothing beyond the physical reality of cause and effect and the nature of human beings. And we never have to say, just because to a skeptic, we can always point to a reason in terms of outcomes or causal necessity. When a moral rule and reality conflict, we side with reality. Traditional systems sometimes double down on the rule, reality be damned, leading to absurd or tragic results. A good example of our framework's superiority is how it handles moral dilemmas. Let's consider one of the most famous moral thought experiments, the trolley problem. The trolley problem revisited moral clarity through determinism. Imagine the classic scenario: a runaway trolley is heading towards 5 people tied on the tracks. You stand by a lever that can divert the trolley onto another track where only 1 person is tied. Do you pull the lever to save 5 lives at the cost of 1 life? This dilemma pits a deontological intuition. Killing is wrong, so don't actively cause a death, against a consequentialist intuition. Saving 5 is better than 1. People agonize over it, moral theories give different answers, and neither answer feels completely satisfying in traditional terms. Now let's apply our deterministic moral framework to the trolley problem. How does it change the analysis? First, determinism strips away the cloud of guilt and blame that often makes the trolley problem hard. In a traditional view, if you pull the lever, you have actively caused a death and might be labelled a murderer, with all the moral condemnation that carries. If you don't pull it, you allowed 5 to die when you could have saved them, which feels wrong, but also you didn't do anything except let events play out. People's reluctance to pull the lever often stems from the feeling of personal moral culpability for the one death. We naturally fear the responsibility of causing harm, even for a greater good, because society conditions us to do no harm. In the deterministic view, however, the issue of personal blame is greatly reduced. You are not a freely choosing murderer. If you pull the lever, you are an instrument of causality making a tragic but calculated decision. The one person's death is a consequence of the situation, not of some evil intent or moral failing on your part. You would not be viewed as a villain deserving punishment. Rather, you'd be seen as someone who unfortunately had to cause harm to prevent a greater harm. Society in a deterministic framework would likely endorse the lever pull in a pragmatic sense. 5 lives saved at the cost of 1 is clearly the better outcome, and since outcomes are what matter, that's the morally. 237. Correct action. There would be compassion for the one lost and for you in having to make that choice, but not a witch hunt to punish you for murder. By focusing on outcomes and stripping away the illusion of metaphysical guilt, the deterministic framework provides moral clarity. It's better to save 5 lives at the expense of 1 life. The calculation is not done coldly or without regret, but it is straightforward. In effect, the right action in this dilemma is whichever action results in less total harm, because moral rightness is defined by harm reduction in our framework. There is no absolute rule, do not kill, that overrides common sense in a specific scenario like this. Do not kill is a rule that serves harm reduction in general, but here, sticking to it by not acting would actually increase harm. Deterministic morality has no issue overriding a general rule when context demands it, because the rules are recognized as tools, not inviolable edicts. Consider how different this is from a purely objective rule system. A strict deontologist might say, I cannot pull the lever, killing is wrong, period. I will not actively cause a death. This stance upholds an objective-sounding rule, but at the cost of 5 lives, which seems morally perverse when you think about consequences. A strict utilitarian might say, of course, pull the lever, calculus demands it, but then might also say, and if that one person was myself or my child, I must still do it dispassionately. Deterministic. Morality would also lean toward pulling the lever, but it allows for the human element. It understands the emotional difficulty. It doesn't demand you be a cold utility maximizer. It simply notes that given we want to save lives, pulling the lever is the better path. If someone couldn't bring themselves to pull it due to emotional anguish, we'd understand that as a determined reaction too, our empathy might freeze us. But we'd still collectively recognize the better outcome that could have been. Furthermore, in a deterministic ethic, we might work ahead of time to avoid such dilemmas. The trolley problem is a contrived scenario with no win-win. A society that embraces deterministic thinking would focus on preventative structures. Why are people tied to tracks in the first place? How can we install automatic brakes or fail-safes on trolleys? It sounds like I'm dodging the hypothetical, but it highlights an important mindset. Deterministic morality emphasizes designing systems to minimize no-win situations. When we see these dilemmas, the lesson is not just what do we do in that moment, but how did we get there and how to not get there again. This is the event horizon concept from earlier. Don't wait until you're at an impossible choice. Intervene upstream. In a way, the best answer to the trolley problem in a deterministic framework is, ideally, redesign the system so such a scenario is extremely unlikely. Nevertheless, if faced with it, the deterministic moral actor assesses causally 5 lives lost versus 1 life lost. There's no karma or eternal sin attached to being the one who flips the switch. If anything, the person flipping the switch is somewhat heroic. They are willing to bear the trauma of causing a death to save 5 others. And indeed, in most public opinion surveys, more people say they would pull the lever, which aligns with consequentialist thinking, but feel uneasy about it. The unease comes from remnants of the old moral intuitions. Our framework would try to alleviate that by reframing the act not as a sin, but as a sad necessity. Now consider a variant, the fat man variant. Push 1 large man off a bridge to stop the trolley, saving 5 on the track. People are more averse to this because it feels more like direct murder. In deterministic terms, it's the same calculus, 1 life versus 5, yet most hesitate because physically pushing someone to their death feels more intentional, more murderous. Deterministic morality would again focus on outcome. If that truly is the only way to save 5%, it's justified by consequences. But importantly, it would also examine why we have such an aversion, likely because evolution and social learning have ingrained in us a taboo against personal violence, which usually serves us well. In the rare trolley case, that ingrained response misfires because the unusual scenario flips the usual script. Usually not killing is the best way to minimize harm here. Killing one prevents more killing. One life versus 5, yet most hesitate because physically pushing someone to their death feels more intentional, more murderous. Deterministic morality would again focus on outcome. If that truly is the only way to save 5%, it's justified by consequences. But importantly, it would also examine why we have such an aversion, likely because evolution and social learning have ingrained in us a taboo against personal violence, which usually serves us well. In the rare trolley case, that ingrained response misfires because the unusual scenario flips the usual script. Usually not killing is the best way to minimize harm here. Killing one prevents more killing. Recognizing this as a deterministic quirk of our psychology can help us make a clear decision despite our gut feelings. In sum, the trolley problem highlights how a deterministic framework can cut through moral paradoxes. There is no absolute moral law being broken by pulling the lever, nor are we beholden to some abstract principle at the expense of lives. We simply analyze the causal scenario and choose the path of less harm. And importantly, after the fact, we don't indulge in recrimination or moral outrage at the person who made the hard choice. We understand why it was done. In a punishment-based ethic, one might bizarrely consider punishing the lever puller for killing the one, since our law might say homicide is illegal even if it saves others, without some justification. In our ethic, the justification is built in. Saving 5 is better. Case closed, no punishment needed. In fact, a deterministic justice system would likely formally exonerate or even commend the act, much as we do in legal systems with the doctrine of necessity or self-defense, but with even less ambiguity. To connect back to our earlier critique of other systems, a purely objective rule system fails here because it can't adapt. Killing is wrong yields a tragic outcome. A purely punishment-oriented mindset might focus on the fact that you murdered one person and feel an urge to punish or guilt trip, which misses the larger picture. Deterministic morality succeeds by being flexible. 241. And context-sensitive, it treats moral decisions as cause-effect problems. Sometimes the least bad option still involves doing something normally bad, but determinism lets us see that in context it was the right determined move. With the trolley problem resolved in principle, we can proceed to the broader, real-world applications of deterministic ethics, how it reshapes our view of justice, social policy, and personal conduct. These are the arenas where the rubber meets the road for any moral theory. And as we'll see, a deterministic approach provides not only clarity in thought experiments, but compassion and effectiveness in practice. Justice in a determined world, from retribution to rehabilitation. Perhaps the most immediate and emotional application of morality is in our justice systems. Society must deal with those who harm others. Traditionally, justice has been heavily tied to the idea of retribution. Wrongdoers should suffer because they chose to do wrong. We've already argued that this idea doesn't hold up under determinism. If criminals don't truly choose to be criminal in a vacuum, punishing them as moral offenders is misguided. So what does justice look like through the deterministic lens? Justice becomes a matter of cause and effect management, not moral vengeance. The goal of a justice system in a deterministic framework is not to inflict suffering on the wicked, to balance some. 242. Cosmic scales. It's to protect society and reduce future harm by addressing the causes and effects of harmful behavior. This leads to a very different attitude. Punishment is not an end in itself. We don't ask, what does this offender deserve? We ask, what action will lead to the best outcome now? Sometimes that might mean incarceration, but not to make them suffer, rather to prevent further harm or to rehabilitate. Sometimes it might mean mandated therapy, community service, education, or other interventions. If a thief stole due to poverty, perhaps the solution is economic opportunity rather than a jail term. If a violent offender has a mental illness, treatment might be more effective than punishment. Rehabilitation and deterrence over retribution. A deterministic system focuses on rehabilitation, changing the person's future behavior by reforming them, and deterrence, using consequences to dissuade others from similar acts as reasons for corrective action. Retribution, eye for an eye, is seen as primitive and unjustifiable, except insofar as it might accidentally serve deterrence. If inflicting some penalty doesn't help reform the person or deter others or safeguard society, then it's simply cruelty. For example, executing or harshly punishing someone for a crime might satisfy some people's sense of revenge, but it could be completely counterproductive if that person could be turned into a law-abiding citizen through other means, or 243. If the harsh punishment doesn't actually deter others, studies often show extreme punishments don't effectively deter crime more than milder ones. acknowledging mitigation and causality. Modern justice already, to a limited extent, acknowledges causality. We consider mitigating factors like duress, insanity, or a difficult childhood when sentencing. Deterministic justice would amplify this. Every crime is understood in context. This doesn't mean people get a free pass because it's not their fault, we still need to protect society, but it means the response is tailored to circumstances. Someone who did wrong due to desperation might get a very different response than someone who did wrong out of calculated greed, because those are different causal scenarios requiring different fixes. Under determinism, we see both as products of cause and effect, but we also see that to change their future behavior, we must alter their circumstances or mindset. Imagine a deterministic justice system at work. Take prisons in many countries. Prisons are primarily punitive, harsh places meant to make offenders suffer for what they did. In a deterministic framework, that approach seems not only cruel, but foolish, because making someone suffer doesn't inherently make them a better person when they get out. It might actually traumatize them further or harden criminal tendencies. So a deterministic prison, if prison is 200 even needed, would look much more like the systems in Norway or other progressive countries, focused on education, therapy, skill building, and reintegration into society. Indeed, those countries today provide a real-world model that aligns with deterministic thinking. For example, Norway's prisons emphasize rehabilitation and humane treatment. Their recidivism, reoffense rates are around 20%, among the lowest in the world, whereas more punitive systems like Italy's have recidivism around 70%. That stark difference suggests that treating people as changeable products of circumstances works better than treating them as little monsters to be locked away. Even the concept of deserve shifts. Does a murderer deserve life in prison or death? In our view, that question is wrong-headed. The murderer should be kept away from society as long as they are a threat, and should be rehabilitated if possible. It's not about what they deserve, it's about what future we want to create. If, hypothetically, we had technology to instantly reform a murderer into a peaceful, empathetic person, a deterministic ethic would say, use it. Don't keep punishing the reformed person for the sake of the past. Traditional retributive ethics might still demand some suffering to pay for the crime, but that's exactly the kind of irrational hangover determinism tells us to drop. As a thought experiment, if a criminal could sincerely apologize and understand their wrong, and we could undo the harm caused, imagine even resurrecting a victim with sci-fi tech, would we still need to punish? Retributivists might grapple with whether wrong must be paid for. Determinists would say no, the balance is restored, move on. Moral responsibility doesn't disappear, it transforms. We still hold people responsible in that we hold them as the locus where change must occur. You did this, so you will be subject to interventions, but we don't attach metaphysical blame. It's similar to how we handle, say, a dangerous dog. If a dog bites people, we don't think it's morally evil, but we will still restrain or train it for safety. While humans are far more complex, and we treat them with dignity, the core idea is we respond to the behavior's causes and effects, not to a presumed evil will. This has a humanizing effect. Paradoxically, viewing someone as determined can make us more compassionate. Instead of labeling a criminal as simply a bad person, we might see a person who had a cascade of influences that led to a bad outcome. We might feel pity or sympathy rather than hatred, even as we firmly intervene to prevent harm. That shift in attitude can also affect how effectively we rehabilitate them. If you treat someone as capable of change and as a human being, they're more likely to respond to reform. One might worry, if we go too far with this, do we risk being soft on crime? Deterministic morality says, be effective on crime. Sometimes that means very robust intervention. If someone is truly dangerous and cannot be rehabilitated at present, protecting society could mean they are isolated permanently, what traditional system would call a life sentence, but we'd frame as indefinite containment for public safety. The difference is, we wouldn't do it to hurt them, we'd do it because we must prevent harm. If later we find a way to rehabilitate or mitigate the danger, we would revisit and possibly release them. So it's neither soft nor hard, it's smart and adaptive. In fact, deterrence, one of the valid reasons for punishment, still operates under determinism. People are deterred by consequences because consequences shape behavior, cause and effect. If knowing that you will definitely be caught and sent to a very effective rehabilitation program with some loss of freedom meanwhile deters you, great. If not, perhaps stricter immediate measures are needed. But even deterrence is a forward-looking rationale. We apply consequences to influence future actions, not to balance a moral book. We also explore alternatives in a deterministic spirit if we discover, for example, that certain neurotechnological treatments could reduce criminal impulses. A deterministic ethic would consider using them carefully, with respect for individual rights as much as possible, as part of justice. Because if crime has physiological contributors, then medicine might be better than punishment. These are delicate areas, but ignoring them because of a myth of absolute responsibility isn't wise either. In short, justice becomes about engineering better behavior and safer societies, not about casting sinners into hellfire. This makes it more compassionate and ultimately more effective. We already see hints of this in movements toward restorative justice, where offenders meet victims, make amends, and rehabilitative justice. Deterministic moral forces gives a strong philosophical foundation for those trends. With justice addressed, we can step back to an even wider view. How do we shape society itself to embody these principles? That brings us to the realm of policy and collective responsibility. Preventing harm at the roots, shaping society through deterministic ethics. If individuals aren't sole authors of their actions, but rather participants in a web of causes, then moral responsibility isn't just an individual affair, it's deeply collective. Society itself bears responsibility for the conditions that give rise to good or bad outcomes. Recognizing this shifts our ethical focus upstream. Rather than just reacting to bad behavior after it happens, we aim to prevent bad behavior and bad outcomes generally by arranging the determinants in favor of the good. This perspective could revolutionize public policy. Consider major social ills, crime, poverty, addiction, even ignorance. The traditional moralizing approach might say crime is caused by bad people making bad choices, poverty might be blamed on laziness, addiction on lack of willpower, ignorance on lack of trying. A deterministic approach says no, these problems have causes, and if we address the causes, we solve the problems. We remove the moralistic finger-wagging and treat it as a practical issue of inputs and outputs. Examples of shaping conditions: education and opportunity. If a lack of education and opportunity is found to correlate with higher crime rates, and it does, then providing better schooling. Job training and economic opportunities in at-risk communities is not just a nice social policy, it's a moral imperative under determinism. It's how we engineer fewer criminals. You don't want as much crime? Improve the determinants. Don't wait to punish a poorly educated, desperate person for robbing someone. Try to ensure fewer people become desperate and uneducated in the first place. Healthcare and mental health. Many harmful behaviors stem from untreated mental illness or addiction, which itself is often self-medication for trauma. A deterministic ethic pushes us to invest heavily in mental health care, addiction treatment, and overall healthcare. It's much more effective and humane to treat depression or schizophrenia, thus preventing possible violence or self-harm. That could result than to jail someone after a breakdown. If we know childhood trauma increases the likelihood of future aggression or crime, then providing therapy and support for traumatized children is a moral duty of society. Economic structure, poverty and inequality can fuel crime, reduce trust, and generally harm social cohesion. A deterministic approach doesn't see poor people as morally inferior or rich people as morally superior. It sees an unequal system that predictably produces certain moral outcomes: desperation, crime, resentment. Thus it calls for structural changes, maybe a stronger safety net, universal basic income, job programs, fairer wages. The idea is to design out the conditions that breed what we call immoral behavior. Urban planning and environment, even factors like how cities are built or what environments people grow up in, can influence behavior. Poorly lit streets increase crime opportunities, lack of community spaces can diminish social bonds, etc. Every field becomes an avenue for moral action. Architecture, city planning, media, technology, each can be used to nudge society toward better outcomes. For example, there's research suggesting that simple changes like adding greenery to neighborhoods can reduce stress and aggression. A deterministic morality takes that seriously. Planting trees becomes a tiny piece of crime prevention and well-being promotion, not just beautification. This idea isn't about a nanny state or heavy-handed social engineering in the dystopian sense. It's about recognizing our collective power and responsibility to shape the world that in turn shapes us. We do this all the time, albeit piecemeal. Existential Logicism is urging us to do it consciously as a moral project. Instead of arguing at the level of people should behave better, we ask what conditions help people behave better. Then we implement those. The metaphor used earlier in the event horizon discussion captures it well. Don't wait until a person is at the cliff's edge of a bad choice. Guide their path long before they get there. If you know a particular neighborhood yields a lot of high school dropouts who join gangs, intervene when those kids are 5, 6, 7 years old with extra support, mentors, resources. If you know certain patterns lead to bankruptcy and financial ruin, educate and regulate to protect people from predatory traps. Essentially, widen the path, add guardrails, and give people, determined as they are, the best possible shot to lead constructive lives. Systems, not just individuals, bear moral accountability. In a deterministic moral view, it makes sense to say the system failed just as much as to say the individual failed. If a corporation designs an algorithm that ends up spreading misinformation and inciting violence, think of social media issues, that corporation and its algorithm design are part of the causal chain for immoral outcomes. They have moral responsibility in the causal sense. They ought to modify the algorithm, and indeed, we ought to regulate such things, because otherwise we're just letting a harmful cause run rampant and then blaming individuals who get influenced. Another example, if the law overly criminalizes certain minor behaviors leading to mass incarceration, as seen with harsh drug laws, the law itself is a moral failing of the system. Under determinism, changing the law is as much a moral action as telling people don't do drugs. More so, perhaps, because laws we can change directly. This collective focus doesn't absolve individuals from participating in moral improvement. After all, individuals are the ones who make up the systems. But it reminds each of us that our moral duties extend beyond our personal choices. If you're a policymaker, designing fair policies is a moral duty. If you're a business leader, creating a humane corporate culture, knowing your decisions affect employee well-being and behavior is a moral duty. Even as a voter or citizen, supporting evidence-based policies over punitive quick fixes is a moral choice. Deterministic morality aligns with the idea of doing what works ethically. It's inherently empirical, try approaches, measure outcomes, adjust accordingly. For example, if decriminalizing certain offenses and focusing on treatment shows better results, as has been seen with drug decriminalization in some countries, then that is the moral path because it reduces harm and improves lives. Old moralists might protest, but using drugs is wrong, we can't go easy on it. The deterministic answer, what matters is reducing addiction and harm, not punishing the wrongdoing. If easing off punishment achieves the goal better, then that's the morally right thing to do. Our loyalty is to results, not to dogma. In effect, morality becomes a dynamic, self-correcting system, much like science. We have hypotheses, e.g., providing free school lunch will reduce theft or behavioral issues among kids. We test them, and we adopt what works. Contrast this with ideologically driven morality, where you might insist on a rule or policy even if it consistently fails because you believe in it. Deterministic ethics has no patience for that kind of stagnation. It's also an optimistic view. It implies that many of our worst problems are solvable if we muster the will to tackle the causes. We're not resigned to bad people exist. Evil is a mystery. We say, bad outcomes have causes. Let's eliminate the causes. There will always be challenges, new causes can arise, and complexity is high, but there's nothing in principle that's off limits to improvement. This echoes the spirit of Enlightenment thinking, but without the naive idea that everyone is rational. Here, we acknowledge people are not freely rational, they're shaped, so we shape the shaping influences. Finally, what about technology? The technological moral responsibility, in our context, is that technology is just another set of tools that massively influence conditions. Using technology ethically becomes crucial. For instance, automating away drudgery and providing abundance, ending artificial scarcity, could eliminate a lot of theft or conflict born from competition over resources. That's a moral use of tech. Conversely, technology used to manipulate or exploit people's weaknesses, say apps designed to be addictive or surveillance that oppresses, is immoral because of its deterministic impacts. So, guiding tech development toward harm reduction and empowerment fits right into our framework. We've painted a picture of society striving to preempt moral problems by tackling root causes. But morality isn't only a social or systemic matter. It also lives in the everyday choices of each person. So our final piece of the puzzle is the question, how should I, as an individual who doesn't have free will, live and act morally? Let's address personal ethics under determinism. Living morally without free will, personal ethics reimagined. If every choice I make is determined, what's the point of trying to be a good person? This is a question that often arises when people first encounter the idea of determinism. The worry is that it sounds like fatalism. If it's all predetermined, why not just let things happen? But determinism is not fatalism. Fatalism is the idea that outcomes will happen no matter what, so our efforts don't matter. Determinism says outcomes have specific causes, including our efforts. In fact, our deliberation and efforts are part of the causal chain that leads to outcomes. So living morally still very much matters, because whether you deliberate ethically or not will affect what you do, which will affect the world. From a first-person perspective, you will still experience life as making choices. Knowing philosophically that those choices are determined doesn't change the fact that you have to go through the process of deciding what to do. Think of it like this. A chess-playing robot might be completely deterministic, but it still decides each move based on computations. Similarly, we decide based on our mental computations. Understanding determinism just encourages us to program those computations through habit, education, reflection in the best way possible. So how do we approach personal ethics if we adopt determinism? 1. Embrace practical agency, drop ultimate agency. You, as a person, obviously have the capacity to consider options and pick one. Determinism doesn't tell you to stop doing that. It tells you why you're doing that, and that ultimately there was only one outcome once all inputs were set. But you don't know the outcome until you go through the decision process. So you keep acting as an agent. You weigh pros and cons, you reflect on consequences, you attempt to restrain harmful impulses and encourage kind ones. What you drop is the egoistic notion that I could at this moment do something completely contrary to my character or reasons. No, you won't. And that's okay. Your focus shifts from willing the right thing in the moment to cultivating the right causes in yourself over time. For example, if I want to be honest, but I often lie out of habit or fear, under determinism I recognize that just trying really hard in the moment might not work, because my tendency to lie is caused by anxiety, perhaps. Instead, I work on the causes. Maybe I practice honesty in low-stakes situations to build confidence, or I address the fear that leads me to lie. I basically re-engineer my environment and mind incrementally, tell friends to hold me accountable, remove temptations to lie, etc. It's like acknowledging I'm a machine that can be tinkered with rather than a magic spirit that can just decide to be different spontaneously. 2. Compassion for self and others. Personal determinism can actually be freeing in terms of guilt and judgment. If you make a mistake or do something you regret, beating yourself up endlessly with "I'm horrible, I freely chose to do bad" isn't productive. Instead, a healthier response is, okay, I did that because of XYZ factors. How can I change those factors in the future so I don't do it again? You take responsibility in a causal way without drowning in shame. Same with others. If someone wrongs you, you still hold them accountable. You don't just let it slide necessarily, but you can also understand they're a product of causes. This can reduce bitterness and desire for revenge. For instance, if someone cuts you off in traffic and you're angered, you might consider maybe they're having a bad day or a personal emergency. Something caused them to act rudely. It diffuses the situation emotionally. 3. Continuous improvement, not moral perfection. Without an objective scorecard, morality becomes about improving outcomes, not achieving saintliness. You won't go to hell for failing nor to heaven for succeeding. Rather, if you slack in moral behavior, consequences will play out in real time. You might hurt relationships, feel internal discord, etc. And if you act better, you'll likely see benefits, trust from others, personal satisfaction, better results. So your motivation to be moral comes from understanding those causal connections, not from a guilt trip or a celestial reward. You essentially become a moral scientist of your own life, noticing what actions lead to better states and trying to do more of those. 4. Avoid judgmentalism and embrace understanding. When you understand that people are products of their circumstances, you become less quick to judge harshly. This doesn't mean you lack moral discernment. You still recognize when something is harmful or wrong. But you don't attach the same scorn to the person. You might criticize the action. That was hurtful and I can't. Allow it. While still retaining empathy for the individual. Mind, I see how you got there. Let's try to work through it. This approach can improve personal relationships. Parents, for example, might discipline their children with a clearer head. Instead of "my kid was bad out of defiance, I must punish." It's "my kid did something harmful. What caused that and how can I address the cause?" Perhaps the child is seeking attention, or is confused, or mimicking something. The response then can be more constructive. 5. Focus on intentions and outcomes, not abstract goodness. Without free will, the moral worth of a person is not some inherent quality they freely cultivate. It's basically the pattern of their actions and intentions, which come from their character, which comes from causes. So in living morally, you focus on being the kind of person who produces good outcomes. That means cultivating compassion, knowledge, and discipline, all the attributes that typically lead to beneficial actions. If you understand that, for example, unchecked anger in you leads to harming loved ones, you morally work on your anger, maybe via therapy or meditation or simply habits. The point isn't to prove you're a good person, it's literally to cause less pain. This is a subtle shift. It makes morality less about image or identity and more about practical effect. Someone might strongly self-identify as virtuous, yet leave a trail of hurt due to arrogance. Deterministic ethics would say that self-identification is meaningless. If the outcomes are bad, better to quietly adjust your behavior, so outcomes improve, regardless of what label you or others put on you. 6. Use understanding of determinism as a tool, not an excuse. A potential pitfall. If everything's determined, can I just say, "Oh well, that's just how I am," and not try to change? That would be a misinterpretation. Yes, you're determined by current factors, but you're also capable of change through new factors. And knowing about determinism is itself a new factor that can influence you. Think of it this way. If I know I have a short temper because of stress, I can start going to the gym to manage stress. That decision arises from understanding cause and effect. So rather than excuse yourself, you actually become more strategic about changing yourself. You kind of take a third-person view of your first-person self. Given who I am, what's likely to make me a bit more patient or honest or courageous over time? Then you implement it. Maybe it's seeking different friends, or reading certain books, or consciously reflecting each day. All those choices will also be determined by your new belief in self-improvement, perhaps, but they are choices you experience and which alter your trajectory. At the same time, you won't indulge in moral hypocrisy as easily. If I do something wrong, I can't say I could have done otherwise, I just chose not to. Instead, I say I did that. It reflects something in me or my situation that I need to address. In a way, it's more honest. People often use the belief in free will to excuse themselves. I could do the right thing, I just didn't feel like it, which is a way to hold on to a self-image of being good in potential, even if not in actuality. Determinism is like, no, you are your actions. If you didn't do the right thing, then those potentialities don't count until they manifest. But the upside is, you can manifest them by changing conditions. So get to work, kindly. 7. Finding meaning and motivation. Some worry that if things are determined, life loses meaning. On the contrary, understanding how things work can give a deeper sense of meaning. You are part of a vast causal tapestry, and what you do echoes in that web. Every action you take has ripples. Even if there's no ultimate cosmic score, you have the very real significance of influencing others' lives and your own environment. Many deterministic philosophies, like certain Buddhist teachings, for example, find great meaning in compassion and wisdom precisely because they alleviate suffering in this interconnected web. Existential Logicism says we create meaning through our commitments and actions. Deterministic morality gives a clear criterion for one kind of meaning, contributing positively to the world in ways that can be observed and felt. Finally, living morally without free will invites a certain humility. We realize there, but for circumstances go, I might have ended up very differently if I had different genes or upbringing. This humility fosters tolerance and peace. It also fosters gratitude. You recognize all the ways luck or help from others shaped your good qualities, so you feel grateful and perhaps obligated to pay it forward, since others' fates are still being written by present circumstances. In summary, individual ethics under determinism means actively engaging in self-shaping and world-shaping behaviors with the knowledge of why those behaviors matter. We still avoid doing harm, still try to be honest, kind, courageous. Those virtues remain, but we justify them not by saying because I freely choose to be virtuous, but because these virtues have positive effects on myself and others. And if we fail, we don't waste time with self-loathing, we analyse and adjust. It's a very practical, almost engineering approach to one's moral life, but it doesn't lack warmth. Indeed, compassion becomes central. Now we have assembled all the pieces, from the dismantling of objective morality to the assertion of determinism, from the illusion of free will to the reimagining of justice, society and personal life. It's time to tie it all together and state clearly why this deterministic moral framework is not just another theory, but arguably a more coherent, effective, and human approach to ethics than any that has come before. Conclusion: morality as an emergent pattern of deterministic forces. We began with the wreckage of objective, free will-based morality, and from it we have constructed a new edifice, deterministic moral forces. Let's highlight what we've achieved in this construction. A logically consistent framework, we resolve the is-ought gap by showing that oughts are grounded in the reality of what we are and what outcomes we seek. We eliminated internal contradictions that plagued prior systems, like punishing people as if they had absolute choice while knowing they didn't. Our moral framework doesn't require belief in anything supernatural or unprovable. It only asks us to accept what science and experience tell us. Cause and effect reign in human behavior. An emergent, not imposed, morality. Instead of morality being a foreign element imposed by gods or abstract principles, it emerges naturally. We view moral rules as real and important, but real in the way language or culture is real, not in the way atoms are real. They exist because we exist and interact. This makes morality ours, a human project, which paradoxically makes it more meaningful. We care about it because it arises from our cares. A focus on outcomes and reduction of harm. By dropping pretenses of cosmic justice, we can focus like a laser on what actually causes suffering or flourishing. The ethical question shifts from what is right in itself to what works to produce the world we want to live in. This is a more answerable question. It makes ethics a shared enterprise of learning and cooperation. Compassion and understanding at its core, knowing that everyone is a product of circumstances, encourages empathy. It tones down anger, hatred, and self-righteousness, which in traditional moral disputes often inflame conflict. A deterministic society might be more forgiving, while still being firm against harm. That combination, forgiving of the person, firm on the act, is powerful. It is what allows restorative justice, reconciliation, and true rehabilitation. Adaptability and growth. Because we don't cling to dogmatic rules, a deterministic moral system can evolve with new evidence and conditions. Morality becomes a continuous improvement process. This adaptability means it can handle new moral dilemmas, like those arising from technology or changing social norms, without the angst of, but is it allowed by scripture or tradition? The only measure is, does it reduce harm and align with our rational goals? If yes, it's good. If no, it's not. If uncertain, experiment and find out. Consistency with human psychology. Rather than demanding people transcend their nature, free will ethics sometimes expects people to make choices utterly contrary to all inclination just out of duty. Deterministic ethics works with human nature. It says, for example, people need praise and encouragement to do well, so it encourages positive reinforcement rather than constant criticism. It acknowledges biases and works around them. It's a very human morality, not an idealized angelic one. By being honest about who we are, it stands a better chance of actually influencing behavior effectively. A unifying perspective, determinism bridges the gap between individual and society, between is and ought, between science and morality. We no longer see human behavior as this mysterious domain apart from the rest of the world. It's of a piece with biology, psychology, sociology. Morality becomes, in a sense, an applied science of human well-being. This doesn't cheapen it, it empowers it. It means moral truths, with a small t, can be discovered, tested, refined. It also unites us all in a shared fabric. We're all subject to the same forces, so we must collectively navigate them. Some might fear that this framework is cold or overly rational, but consider its fruits. Less vindictiveness, more rehabilitation, less moral posturing, more problem-solving, less judgment, more empathy, less stagnation, more innovation in ethics, and ultimately less suffering, more flourishing. Those outcomes are anything but cold. They speak to a deeply humane project. In existential logicism, deterministic moral forces stands as the final pillar because it takes the insights from all previous discussions about existence, logic, consciousness, contingency, and applies them to how we live and treat each other. It is the capstone that shows living in truth. The truth of determinism and absurdity of objective given meaning doesn't lead to despair or amorality. It leads to a clearer, kinder, and more effective morality. We have not created a utopia or a perfect solution to all moral issues. People will still conflict, emotions will still run high, and implementing these ideas is a challenge. But the framework gives us a North Star and a toolbox. It tells us where to aim, a world of less unnecessary suffering, more understanding, and how to correct course when we err by looking at causes and outcomes, not clinging to blame or rigid rules. To conclude, let's revisit the central claim one last time in plain terms. All morality, behavior, and punishment are products of deterministic forces. What does this imply? It implies that whenever you see a moral situation, a crime, a kindness, a dilemma, you should look for the chain of events that led there and the chain of events that will follow from any response. In those chains lie the answers to what to do. This worldview asks us to take responsibility, not in the old sense, own your freely chosen sin, but in a new sense, take responsibility for the part of the causal web that you are. You are not an uncaused causer, but you are a causer nonetheless. You will leave ripples in existence, make them count. Existential Logicism's moral vision is, therefore, one of enlightened pragmatism. It is precise because it is grounded in understanding real factors, powerful because it can actually change things by attacking root causes, and logical because it removes the incoherence of prior approaches. Yet it is not overly academic or removed from life. It is life, viewed courageously as it is, and guided deliberately toward what it could be. In embracing deterministic moral forces, we do not throw up our hands and say everything is fated. We roll up our sleeves and say, if everything is caused, then let's become the most skillful causes we can be. Each of us, and all of us together, can be the forces that determine a better moral reality. This is morality without myth. Morality for a world where humans finally understand ourselves, not as angels or demons, but as determined beings who, through that very understanding, can create a more just and compassionate society. And now, at the end, we reflect. A journey of shared discovery. We arrive together at the conclusion of our journey through existential logicism, having peeled back layer after layer of philosophical confusion. This has been a process of shared discovery. Each step was taken side by side, author and reader, examining the deepest questions of existence, knowledge, time, morality, and mind. The tone throughout was never one of triumphalism or ego, it was collaborative, reasoning. Now, as we reflect on what has been accomplished across the 7 pillars of this framework, the feeling is not pride, but clarity. We have not won a debate, we have simply seen the truth emerge once the contradictions were cleared away, and the truth we've uncovered was always there, waiting for us to notice. From the outset, we set a welcoming tone. The complexities of philosophy were approached with steady logic and without arrogance. In that same spirit, let us recap, not by rehashing each chapter in detail, but by appreciating the cohesive understanding we've built. Over the course of 7 pillars, we systematically dismantled a series of powerful illusions and resolved long-standing paradoxes. In doing so, we've upgraded our epistemological framework, the very way we understand reality. The result is a perspective that feels both empowering and undeniable. It's not that we, author or reader, have invented something new. Rather, together we've uncovered a structure that was always true and is now clearly visible. Outro. Well, we made it this far. From contradictions to coherence. Philosophy's greatest riddles often turned out to be misconceptions, problems arising from false premises or unchecked assumptions. By tackling them one by one, we haven't declared others wrong so much as revealed a clearer path through logic. Each pillar of existential logicism addressed a fundamental source of confusion. Non-existence over nothingness, we began by dispelling the notion that nothingness could ever be real. It became clear that there has only ever been something rather than nothing, because true nothingness is not a coherent possibility. This insight wasn't a fancy speculation, but a logical certainty. An illusion, the illusion of nothingness, was exposed, grounding us in the inescapable presence of existence. And as self-grounded reality, building on that, we eliminated the spectre of infinite regress. Every effect must have a cause, but an endless chain of causes explains nothing. We discovered that reality must anchor itself. There must be a self-grounded foundation that requires no prior cause. This logical elimination of infinite regress cut the endless loop and showed that existence, by necessity, contains its own explanation. For now, as the only time, we re-examined our understanding of time and found clarity in the persistent present. Past and future, we realized, are not things that exist in themselves, but concepts we carry in mind. Only the present moment is real and active. By embracing this, we resolved the classic paradoxes of time. Causality became straightforward. It unfolds only in the present, the only arena where reality truly happens. The confusion of time's nature fell away, replaced by a simple, empowering insight. The now is all that is. Notice how these first insights fundamentally changed our view of reality. After the first three pillars, existence was no longer a mystery of why is there something rather than nothing. We saw that nothing was never an option. Causality was no longer an infinite maze, it had a beginning in a self-sufficient ground, and time was no longer a puzzling river in which we might get lost. It was the clear lake of the present, ever contained in each moment. We moved from a cosmos that could seem arbitrary or paradoxical to one that has an inevitable, logical structure. This is intellectual clarity of the highest order. A scattered puzzle was reassembled into a coherent picture. Crucially, at no point did we insert an unjustified assumption or a leap of faith. Each conclusion flowed logically from the last, giving us confidence that our footing at every step was sound. Redefining morality and mind. With reality's foundations clarified, we turned our attention to human values and consciousness, areas often dominated by debate and dogma. We found that a steady application of logic could cut through confusion. And minds make morals. Through the contingency guillotine, we sliced cleanly through the age-old claim of objective morality. We came to see that any moral rule or ought is inevitably contingent on minds, on the desires, needs, or agreements of conscious beings. Morality could not float free of us as an absolute truth. It is anchored in perspective and context. This wasn't a cynical conclusion that anything goes, but a clear recognition that moral frameworks are constructed rather than discovered in the fabric of the universe. By accepting that, we removed the false pedestal of objective morality and freed ourselves to examine ethics as they truly function. A determined heart of ethics. Once morality was placed on a human foundation, we introduced deterministic moral forces to rebuild ethics on firmer ground. If every action and choice is cause determined by genetics, environment, upbringing, and circumstance, then the traditional notion of blame based on free will must be rethought. We acknowledged the evidence and logic that free will is an illusion, and in doing so, reframed moral responsibility. Ethics became about understanding cause and effect, about creating systems that guide behavior constructively rather than punish for punishment's sake. This deterministic perspective doesn't render morality meaningless. It makes it functional. We shifted from seeing morality as a pronouncement from some external authority to seeing it as a tool, a necessary, pragmatic language that conscious beings use to minimize harm and live together. In the process, every moral paradox rooted in ultimate blame or absolute evil versus good dissolved. We found a way to talk about right and wrong that is consistent with how the world actually works. These revelations transform the reader at a moral and emotional level. Gone is the confusion of how can there be any morality if it isn't objective, replaced by a humble understanding that while our values are not woven into the stars, they are no less important. In fact, they become more meaningful when we see them as our collective creation, subject to reason and improvement. And gone too is the harsh judgment of others as absolutely free agents deserving absolute blame, replaced by a focus on causes and compassionate accountability. This is an empowering shift. Our sense of justice is not weakened by determinism, it's made wiser and gentler. We end the philosophical war between free will and determinism by simply accepting what logic and science have long suggested. Our will is part of the causal fabric of reality. Ethics built on that understanding are not a compromise. They are, as we argued together, the only kind that make logical sense. One mind beyond the human, in exploring the spectrum of consciousness, we further expanded our perspective. We let go of the simplistic, binary idea that an entity either has full consciousness or none at all. It became clear that consciousness comes in degrees and forms, a continuous spectrum ranging across life forms and even artificial minds. By embracing this, we did more than resolve a scientific or philosophical question. We opened our minds to a more inclusive understanding of what deserves moral consideration. If lesser degrees of consciousness exist in animals or advanced AI, then our circle of ethical concern must expand accordingly. Here again, the feeling is not triumph but enlightenment. A bias we might not have even noticed in ourselves, that deeply human tendency to regard our own kind as the sole bearers of mind and meaning, is gently but firmly corrected by logic. We leave with a worldview that is both more rational and more compassionate. Rational, because it recognizes continuity and evidence in nature. Compassionate, because it acknowledges kinship, where before there was a hard line of us versus it. The implications of accepting consciousness as a spectrum are profound. They invite us, calmly and logically, to reassess how we treat non-human animals, to reconsider the future of artificial intelligence, and to approach these issues without the old presumptions. We find ourselves equipped with a framework that can adapt to new forms of life and mind, should they appear, without losing moral clarity. This adaptability is a testament to the strength of the structure we've built. By basing our views on logic and evidence rather than ego or tradition, we ensure that our philosophy remains solid even as our knowledge grows. The inescapable truth of experience. Perhaps the most quietly revolutionary outcome of this journey is a transformation in our understanding of knowledge itself, an upgrade to our epistemology. After overturning so many illusions and embracing so many new perspectives, one might wonder, How can we trust any of this? What gives us the right to feel so confident in these conclusions, when history is full of people convinced by ideas later proven wrong? The answer was waiting in our final pillar, the epistemic refutation paradox, and it is as simple as it is unshakable. Our own experience is undeniably real, and it is from this bedrock that all knowledge grows. By now, the reader has seen the pattern. Whenever we encountered a claim that nothing can be known, or all is uncertain, we found a contradiction hiding in it. The act of doubting presupposes a doubter. The act of experiencing illusion still is an experience. In the end, subjectivity itself is the inescapable fact. We discovered that any attempt to refute the reality of one's own consciousness becomes entangled in absurdity. You cannot coherently claim to experience nothing, for the very claim itself is an experience. This was not a trick or wordplay, it was the logical safety line that prevents us from falling into complete skepticism. It means that, while we remain humble about what we know, we are not lost in nihilism or radical doubt. There is a core truth each of us carries, cogito, ergo sum, rephrased for our time. I experience, therefore this is real. From that starting point, all the pillars of existential logicism gain even more strength. We did not base our arguments on divine revelation or untestable suppositions. We base them on what must be true given what we undeniably experience: existence, causality, consciousness, values, etc. Thus, by the final pages of this book, an empowering realization sets in. If none of these 7 pillars can be logically refuted without contradiction, then they stand as part of the very structure of reality and reason. Accepting them is not a matter of loyalty to the author or adherence to a dogma. It is simply yielding to truth. We are compelled to accept these conclusions just as we accept that day follows night, not because someone insists on it, but because the alternative is logically impossible. This is epistemic confidence of the best kind. It does not breed arrogance, because these truths don't belong to any one person. They were there all along. Instead, it breeds a quiet confidence and a clear mind. We can move forward knowing that our foundation is firm. We have identified the points where a thinking mind can anchor itself without fear of error. Existence is, time is now, causality self-resolves, morality is ours to shape, consciousness pervades, and experience undeniably exists. These are not fantastical notions. They are unavoidable conclusions once the fog of contradiction has been cleared, an ending that is a beginning. In closing, we find ourselves at both a culmination and a commencement. The confusions that plagued our inquiries at the start, the endless debates that seemed unsolvable, have been put to rest. This feels like an ending, the end of philosophical stalemates, the end of wondering if reality might fundamentally not make sense. There is a tremendous relief in that clarity. Yet, this is not an end in the sense of finality or exhaustion. It is more like arriving at the solid ground after a long climb. Now that we are here, a new vista opens up. If this framework is correct, if existential logicism truly maps the logical structure of reality, then our journey is just beginning. With a coherent foundation in place, we can begin to build beyond it. The 7 pillars we have established are not walls closing us in, they are pillars holding up an open sky of further exploration. On this grounded platform, any new ideas or theories we consider will be different from before. We won't be building on sand, and we will notice very quickly if something we propose conflicts with the unshakable truths we've laid out. In that way, this ending protects us from sliding back into confusion. It marks the end of a certain kind of intellectual wandering, the kind that loops back on itself in paradox and uncertainty. We need not wander in circles anymore, but it also marks the beginning of a more purposeful journey forward. The reader who has come this far has, in a sense, been transformed. Not in personality or beliefs, but in their epistemological stance, the way they hold themselves in relation to questions about reality. Together we have cultivated a habit of following arguments to their logical conclusion, of not turning away when the implications get challenging, and of trusting reason over comfort. That habit, once formed, is a powerful tool to carry into the rest of life. It means that whatever problems or mysteries remain, and surely many do, the wonder of philosophy is far from over, we now approach them with a sharper lens and a steadier hand. We can face new questions without the old baggage of assumed contradictions. In fact, we might discover that many new questions dissolve or transform when examined under this clearer light. As we close the cover on existential logicism, the feeling to carry with us is one of grounded hope. Not the brittle hope that clings to a particular answer, but the sturdy hope that comes from understanding. We have seen that when reasoning is careful and uncompromising, it can illuminate even the darkest problems. We have seen that clarity is possible. The world has not changed during our journey, but our comprehension of it has, and that makes all the difference. This is the end of confusion. We no longer have to feel adrift in paradoxes of existence, time, or mind. And it is the beginning of grounded thought. From now on, any inquiry we pursue rests on bedrock we have examined and found secure. In sharing this journey, author and reader stand together on that bedrock. The tone in these final moments remains welcoming and steady, because the truth we've uncovered welcomes all who are willing to see it, and it stands steady against scrutiny. There is no giddy celebration needed, no declarations of victory, only the simple acknowledgement of what is. And what is, we now see with epistemic confidence, is a universe ordered by logic from the ground up. an existence that makes sense when approached without illusion. We conclude not with fanfare, but with a clear gaze forward. The philosophical landscape is open, and we are prepared to walk it with sure footing. The ultimate reward of this journey is precisely this empowerment, the quiet assurance that we can trust reality's coherence and our capacity to understand it. This framework we've uncovered is both a conclusion and an invitation. It concludes our search for a consistent foundation, and it invites us to live and think from this foundation onward. Together, we have arrived at something undeniable and enduring. It was always there. Now it is clearly visible. The task ahead is simply to use this clarity well. Let us step forward then into the future of thought, grounded firmly in reason, with eyes open to what is, and with the confidence that comes from truth clearly seen. The journey of existential logicism ends here, but the journey of reason and understanding continues, stronger than ever. So long, stranger.
All right, y'all, and so that's the whole book completed. All 7 pillars are laid out. The epistemic refutation paradox, the illusion of nothing, the logical elimination of the infinite regress, the persistent present, the spectrum of consciousness, the contingency guillotine, and deterministic morality. And those are the 7 pillars of existential logicism, a logic-based tool for getting through reality. And I hope y'all enjoyed it. I'm not expecting everybody, like the whole world, just to flip over and just believe everything I say. But at the very least, I hope things I said challenged your worldview, made you think about things you believe. And even if the end result was you just believe what you believe more than you did before, then that's still something. Because the idea behind philosophy and science is to push things forward. And I'm just trying to do that in any little way I can. And like I said, I hope I did that. And if I didn't, then I hope at least we had fun together. And I'll be posting more. Like I could talk for hours and hours about all of this. And UEFT, I could just go on and on and on. The problem is getting all that arranged in a way that's coherent and worth watching for y'all. So that's what I'll be working on here in the future now that everything is kind of up in its most basic form. This was supposed to be the most approachable version of this. What's going to be coming in the future is probably just going to be, I mean, it's just more detailed, more in-depth. That's really, it is what it is. But what's up, baby girl? But I think that's it. Again, I just want to say thank you. Both books are on Amazon, at least on the Kindle version. I know Existential Logicism has the hard copy version up. Amazon KDP is a little difficult sometimes, so it's not exactly telling me why it's not accepting the file. So I don't know. I may have to do something different there, but you can get a copy of both on Amazon. But I appreciate everybody. Y'all have a